It began not with battle, but with collapse. A slow, creaking, grinding collapse of an entire war machine that had once thundered across continents. The Ruhr, the beating industrial heart of Germany, had powered armies, fueled factories, and fed the ambitions of a regime that promised a 1,000-year future. But by the spring of 1945, those promises had rotted into smoke, drifting above shattered cities. The Ruhr Valley lay under a sky the colour of cooling ash. Chimneys stood silent. Bridges lay broken across quiet rivers, rail lines twisted like torn threads. Fields that once fed millions were scarred by tank treads and shell craters. Villages, towns, cities, all exhausted. All fractured, all watching the front creep closer like a tide that no human force could hold back. And inside this region, millions were trapped. Soldiers running out of ammunition. Civilians running out of hope. Factories running out of fuel. Commanders running out of lies to tell. Their men. The Americans approached from the west, the British closed from the north, the French advanced from the south, and the circle tightened day by day, hour by hour, until the land itself felt smaller, denser, heavier, as though the very soil understood it was becoming a cage. The German High Command ordered resistance, but the soldiers in the Ruhr were tired shadows of the armies that once marched across Europe. Some were veterans who had watched years collapse into months and months into frantic days. Others were boys pulled from classrooms, wielding rifles too heavy for their shoulders. Many simply stared at the ruins around them and wondered when the world had lost its shape. The Allies knew the Ruhr was not merely territory. It was symbolism. It was lifeblood. It was the last engine that kept the war moving. To encircle it was to choke the heart of the German war effort. To capture it was to end the war's final momentum. To seal it shut was to make surrender, not just possible, but inevitable. And so they closed in. Columns of American armour rolled along, roads lined with burned-out vehicles. Infantry crept through forests where every broken branch hid uncertainty. Engineers worked through rain and darkness to rebuild bridges faster than the enemy could destroy them. Across the pocket, the sound of artillery never fully stopped a distant heartbeat that refused to fade. German units pulled back, then were pushed again, then finally dissolved into small pockets of resistance, fighting for hours, not causes. Inside the shrinking territory, chaos deepened. Telephone lines died, supply routes vanished, command collapsed into confusion, and civilians huddled in cellars, listening to the rumble of tanks approaching from every direction. By the time the pocket sealed completely, the Ruhr was no longer a battlefield. It was a trapped world of exhausted men, empty factories, ruined streets, and fading orders. A place where the war's final breath trembled between surrender and destruction. And then silence. Not peace, not relief, just silence. The kind that follows exhaustion, so absolute, it cannot even produce words. Tonight, we return to that silence, to the slow closing of a noose made not of rope but of armies, to the tired footsteps of soldiers who fought because they were told to fight, to the civilians who waited in darkness for the sound of the war to finally stop, to the last great pocket of resistance that crumbled not with violence, but with inevitability. Before we begin, tell me in words where you are listening from tonight and what the world around you sounds like. Is it quiet? Is it busy? Or are you lying somewhere still, ready to drift? Here is a second invitation, unlike any before. Tell me something you appreciate about the night. A sound, a memory, a feeling, anything that makes these late hours meaningful for you. And a third request, completely unique for this documentary, if you could stand in any historical place for a single moment, not to conquer it, not to own it, but simply to feel it, where would it be? A battlefield? A city? A riverbank? A ruin? Your answer becomes part of the night itself. And if these slow, heavy journeys into history help you unwind, help you breathe deeper, or help you fall asleep, consider subscribing. January 12th, 1945. 6,000 feet above the German heartland, a British reconnaissance aircraft banks through freezing clouds, its camera operator pressed against the frigid glass. Below him stretches a landscape that shouldn't exist this late in the war, a vast industrial sprawl, still breathing smoke into the winter sky, still pulsing with the machinery of total war. The Ruhr Valley unfolds beneath his lens like a mechanical monster refusing to die. Every factory he photographs, Every plume of coal smoke rising from the earth, every ribbon of rail line connecting forge to foundry represents something Allied planners have tried to destroy for 5 brutal years. The photographs developing in London that night will confirm what Allied intelligence has feared. The Ruhr remains operational, productive, and absolutely vital to Germany's continued resistance. This 60-mile stretch of industrial land along the Ruhr and Rhine rivers has survived 4 years of strategic bombing, thousands of sorties, and the combined fury of the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces. It's a statistical impossibility that has become a strategic nightmare. The images show the Krupp steelworks in Essen still producing armour plate at a rate of 1,200 tonnes daily. They show coal mines around Dortmund still extracting the black gold that powers everything. They show a manufacturing ecosystem so dense, so interconnected, that trying to destroy it from the air has proven nearly futile. But these photographs reveal more than just industrial capacity. They document a region that has become a fortress, 850 anti-aircraft guns protecting the factories, more concentrated air defence than Berlin itself possesses. The Allies have learned the hard way that strategic bombing alone cannot break the Ruhr. Between 1943 and 1944, the RAF's Battle of the Ruhr cost over 800 bombers and 5,000 airmen, yet production barely faltered. The Germans simply dispersed operations, moved machinery into tunnels, rebuilt faster than the bombs could destroy. Now, as 1945 begins and Allied armies stand at Germany's western borders, a different question emerges. If bombing cannot take the Ruhr, what will? The answer to that question sits in a memo that crosses Albert Speer's desk in mid-December 1944. Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, a man who has performed miracles keeping Germany's war machine functioning despite relentless air attack, writes with unusual bluntness to the Führer. Loss of the Ruhr means loss of the war within weeks, Speer's memo states. Not months, not a protracted defensive struggle, weeks. The statistics supporting this assessment are devastating. 65% of Germany's remaining steel production comes from Ruhr foundries. 2/3 of German coal, the fuel for everything from locomotives to synthetic oil plants, emerges from Ruhr mines. Every Tiger tank, every artillery shell, every rifle carried by Wehrmacht soldiers can trace its creation back to this industrial concentration. Inside the region itself, the human scale of this industrial commitment becomes staggering. 4.5 million civilians still live and work within the Ruhr's boundaries. 300,000 coal miners descend into the earth daily, working shifts that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. In Essen, in Dortmund, in Bochum and Duisburg, factory shifts run 24 hours, staffed by German workers, foreign labourers, and increasingly, slave labour from concentration camps. The moral rot of the Nazi system pervades every foundry and assembly line, yet the production continues, feeding an army that grows weaker daily but refuses to surrender. A coal miner in Gelsenkirchen begins his shift at 4 in the morning, descending into darkness that has become his normal world. He extracts coal with the knowledge that this fuel will power locomotives carrying supplies to soldiers fighting the Soviets in the east and the Americans in the west. He doesn't think about grand strategy or the fate of nations. He thinks about avoiding cave-ins, about the meagre rations that keep him functioning, about whether the Allied armies will arrive before the mine collapses or the city starves. His reality is immediate, physical, and increasingly desperate. The Ruhr's industrial might, viewed from the ground rather than the air, looks less like strength and more like a machine grinding its operators into dust. At Supreme Headquarters Allied, Expeditionary Force in Versailles, American intelligence officers study maps covered with red symbols marking every significant industrial facility in the Ruhr Valley. They count over 150 major installations within a 50-mile radius. They calculate production figures, estimate worker populations, and try to solve a problem that has vexed Allied planners since before D-Day. How do you neutralise this industrial concentration without destroying it so completely that post-war Europe collapses? The challenge isn't just military. It's economic, humanitarian, and political. The Ruhr must be taken, but taking it might transform victory into catastrophe if the destruction is too complete. The strategic importance of the region creates an impossible situation for German military planners. They must defend the Ruhr because losing it means losing the war. But defending it requires troops, equipment, and resources desperately needed elsewhere. By January 1945, The Eastern Front hemorrhages men and material as Soviet armies drive toward Berlin. The Western Front has stabilised after the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's desperate gamble in the Battle of the Bulge, but American and British forces are preparing for the final push into Germany. Every division assigned to defend the Ruhr is a division not available to stop the Soviets or reinforce the Rhine defences. Yet abandoning the Ruhr willingly is unthinkable for a regime that has never willingly ceded anything. The region's geography compounds its strategic value. The Ruhr Valley sits just east of the Rhine, Germany's great natural defensive barrier in the west. Rivers and industrial canals crisscross the landscape, creating natural obstacles that favour defenders. The cities themselves, Essen, Dortmund, Düsseldorf, Duisburg, form an urban sprawl where every factory complex could become a fortress, every residential block a defensive position. Hills rise to the south and east, offering observation points and defensive terrain. The Rhine to the west and the Ruhr River, bisecting the region, create water obstacles that could channel attacking forces into killing zones. For a defensive-minded commander, the Ruhr offers possibilities. For the civilians trapped within it, those same features promise to transform their home into a battlefield. As winter deepens towards spring in early 1945, the Ruhr Valley exists in a strange twilight between production and paralysis. Factory managers receive impossible quotas from Berlin while watching their workforce shrink through bombing casualties, disease, and malnutrition. Transport networks, battered by years of air attack, still function but grow less reliable daily. Food supplies dwindle as agricultural regions fall to Allied advances. The social fabric frays as bombing destroys neighbourhoods, creating hundreds of thousands of refugees within the Ruhr itself. Yet still the factories operate, still the mines produce coal, still the foundries pour steel. The industrial heart of Nazi Germany keeps beating, weakening, with each systemic shock but refusing to stop. What Allied planners haven't yet grasped is that this industrial region, this 60-mile concentration of steel and coal and machinery, is about to become the stage for the largest encirclement battle in Western military history, a battle that will trap hundreds of thousands of soldiers and millions of civilians in a pocket that will shrink day by day until it simply ceases to exist. March 7th, 1945. The telephone call that reaches Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims, France, carries news so unexpected that staff officers initially suspect a mistake. American forces have captured a bridge over the Rhine intact. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, which German demolition teams failed to destroy, now provides a gateway into Germany's industrial heartland. General Dwight Eisenhower stares at the map on his wall, his eyes tracing the routes that suddenly become possible. The Rhine, the barrier his planners expected to face for weeks of costly combat, has been breached by luck and speed. Now the question isn't whether to cross the Rhine, but what to do next. The map shows the Ruhr Valley sitting like a prize and a problem just 60 miles from Remagen. Eisenhower's senior commanders have debated the Ruhr's fate for months, and the unexpected bridge capture forces an immediate decision. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group north of the Ruhr, has advocated for months for a single concentrated thrust north of the industrial region, driving straight for Berlin with maximum force. American General Omar Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group with 900,000 troops, proposes something more ambitious, a double envelopment that would encircle the entire Ruhr Valley, trapping every German soldier and destroying every division defending the region. The debate has raged through planning sessions and tense meetings, mixing military logic with national pride and personal rivalry. Montgomery's proposal carries the weight of British strategic thinking and his own considerable ego. He envisions himself leading the decisive thrust into Germany's heart, his 21st Army Group spearheading the final victory while American forces provide flank protection. His plan has elegance, concentrate maximum combat power on a single axis, overwhelm German defences through sheer mass, and race to Berlin before the Soviets. Montgomery has been advocating for this narrow front strategy since before D-Day, and the unexpected Rhine crossing seems to vindicate his approach. Drive hard, drive fast, ignore the Ruhr, and let it wither. 300,000 troops under his command stand ready north of the industrial region, poised for what Montgomery sees as the war-winning advance. Bradley's counter-proposal reflects a different military philosophy and a very American approach to the problem. Why race past the Ruhr when you can destroy it? Why leave hundreds of thousands of German troops in your rear when you can trap them in a pocket and eliminate them systematically? His plan is operationally elegant. 1st Army drives northeast from the Remagen bridgehead, while 9th Army, temporarily under Bradley's command, swings southeast from positions north of the Ruhr. The two pincers meet somewhere east of the industrial region, creating the largest encirclement in Western Front history. It's ambitious, requiring precise coordination between two massive armies across 70 miles of enemy territory. But if it works, it doesn't just neutralize the Ruhr, it destroys Army Group B, the major German formation in the west. Eisenhower sits in the middle of this strategic debate, a position he has occupied throughout the campaign in northwest Europe. His genius has never been tactical brilliance or operational innovation. His genius is coalition management, balancing British and American interests, mediating between prima donna commanders, making decisions that keep the alliance functional while advancing toward victory. The Ruhr decision crystallizes every tension in his command. Choose Montgomery's plan, and American commanders will feel their massive armies are being subordinated to British glory-seeking. Choose Bradley's plan, and the British will accuse him of abandoning the race to Berlin for a secondary objective. Choose wrong, and the war might last weeks or months longer. The political dimension adds weight to an already complex decision. Winston Churchill has been calling Eisenhower regularly, applying pressure for a rapid advance to Berlin before Soviet forces capture the German capital. The British Prime Minister thinks in terms of post-war Europe, of spheres of influence and occupation zones. He wants Western forces as far east as possible when Germany surrenders. Churchill's March 10th call to Eisenhower carries barely concealed frustration. Why are American armies not driving toward Berlin? Why this obsession with the Ruhr when the real prize lies east? Eisenhower listens politely and makes non-committal responses, knowing that Churchill doesn't grasp the operational realities facing armies that have been fighting since Normandy. The intelligence picture complicates the decision. Allied estimates place roughly 150,000 to 200,000 German troops in and around the Ruhr, significant but not overwhelming numbers. What intelligence doesn't know is the true strength of Field Marshal Walther Model's Army Group B, the force responsible for defending the region. Aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations provide fragments of information, but the complete picture eludes Allied intelligence officers. They don't know that Model commands over 300,000 troops, that his forces include remnants of elite units bloodied, but still dangerous, that the pocket they're contemplating could trap almost twice as many Germans as they estimate. This intelligence failure will prove fortunate. If planners knew the true numbers, they might hesitate. Bradley's staff has been gaming out the encirclement option for weeks. The operational choreography requires 1st Army and 9th Army to advance roughly 70 miles, maintain coordination despite communication challenges, and link up at a precise point while German forces attempt to escape, counterattack, or both. The southern pincer, advancing from Remagen through hilly terrain, faces different challenges than the northern pincer, advancing through flatter ground north of the Ruhr. Timing is everything. Move too slowly, and German forces escape the trap. Move too quickly, and the two armies might lose coordination, creating gaps that German counterattacks could exploit. The plan demands a level of operational precision that hasn't been consistently achieved in the European theatre. On March 15th, Eisenhower makes his decision. He approves Bradley's encirclement plan. 9th Army, operating temporarily under Bradley's 12th Army Group, will drive southeast from positions near Wesel. 1st Army will break out from the Remagen bridgehead and drive northeast. They will meet somewhere near the town of Lippstadt, roughly 70 miles from their starting positions, creating a pocket that will trap the Ruhr Valley and everything in it. Montgomery's 21st Army Group will launch Operation Plunder, a massive Rhine crossing north of the Ruhr on March 23rd and 24th, then provide the northern arm of the encirclement. It's a compromise that gives everyone a role while committing to the encirclement strategy. Montgomery gets his Rhine crossing spectacle. Bradley gets his encirclement. Eisenhower gets a plan that satisfies his coalition management requirements while pursuing clear military objectives. The maps go up on walls in headquarters throughout the European theatre. Staff officers begin calculating logistics, fuel requirements, ammunition stocks, artillery support, engineer capabilities for river crossings, medical facilities for anticipated casualties. Division commanders receive initial movement orders. Intelligence officers intensify efforts to locate German units, identify strongpoints, and predict defensive strategies. The machinery of modern military planning shifts into high gear, coordinating thousands of details that will determine whether this encirclement succeeds or becomes a costly failure. Within 2 weeks, hundreds of thousands of troops will be moving, and the fate of the Ruhr Valley will be decided not in Berlin but on the approaches to industrial cities whose names most Americans and British soldiers can barely pronounce. The largest encirclement battle in Western military history is about to begin, and almost nobody, Allied or German, truly understands what they're about to experience. March 11th, 1945. Field Marshal Walther Model stands before a map in his headquarters at the Oberkommando, studying defensive positions that he knows are inadequate for the task before him. At 54 years old, Model carries a reputation that has made him both valuable and expendable to Adolf Hitler. He is the Führer's fireman, the commander sent to crisis points on the Eastern Front to restore desperate situations through tactical skill and ruthless determination. He has performed miracles in Russia, stabilizing crumbling fronts and organizing withdrawals that saved armies from encirclement. Now Hitler has given him an impossible assignment: defend the Ruhr Valley against the combined might of American and British armies that outnumber his forces, outgun his artillery, and dominate the skies above his positions. Model's military career has prepared him for defensive warfare, but not for the situation he now faces. He earned his reputation on the Eastern Front, where space and Soviet mistakes often provided opportunities for mobile defense and tactical counterattacks. The Western Front offers no such luxuries. Behind him lies the Ruhr Valley, 60 miles of industrial concentration that cannot be abandoned without losing the war. Before him advance Allied armies with unlimited supplies, air superiority so complete that Luftwaffe appearances are rare curiosities, and intelligence capabilities that track his formations with unnerving accuracy. Model's genius is tactical, not strategic. He understands how to position battalions, coordinate artillery, and orchestrate local counterattacks. What he cannot do is create divisions that don't exist, or summon resources that Germany no longer possesses. The forces under Model's command represent a mixture of capability that would alarm any professional military planner. Army Group B officially controls 317,000 troops, a number that sounds substantial, until examined closely. This total includes 5th Panzer Army in the north, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, a capable commander working with formations worn down by months of combat. It includes 15th Army in the south, under General Gustav Adolf von Zangen, defending approaches through hilly terrain with divisions at half strength or less. Scattered throughout the organisational charts are remnants of elite units that once represented the Wehrmacht's finest Panzerlehr division, reduced to a shadow of its Normandy strength, Waffen-SS formations still dangerous but depleted, paratrooper units fighting as infantry because the Luftwaffe can no longer deliver them by air. Model staff officers have calculated the material reality with depressing precision. Ammunition stocks will support 14 days of combat at current consumption rates after that. Artillery falls silent, mortars cease firing, and infantry fight with whatever they can scavenge. Food supplies appear more adequate at 28 days for military personnel, but this calculation doesn't account for the 4.5 million civilians inside the Ruhr who will demand sustenance as combat disrupts normal distribution networks. The tank inventory tells its own story of decline, approximately 50 operational panzers scattered across Army Group B, mostly Mark IV medium tanks and a handful of Panther heavies, no Tiger tanks. No fuel reserves for sustained mobile operations. No replacement parts for battle damage. The panzer divisions exist on organisational charts, but their combat power has evaporated through attrition and supply failure. The Luftwaffe's absence from Model's defensive planning reflects the broader collapse of German air power. Where once fighter squadrons would have contested every Allied advance, now the skies belong entirely to American and British aircraft. Model cannot expect air reconnaissance to warn of enemy movements. He cannot rely on tactical air support to break up Allied concentrations. His troops will fight without the overhead protection that defined Wehrmacht operations earlier in the war. The psychological impact of this air superiority demoralises even veteran soldiers who have endured years of combat. They know that every road march invites strafing attacks, that every concentration of vehicles attracts bomb strikes, that the sky itself has become enemy territory. March 15th brings a radio message from Hitler's headquarters that removes any remaining operational flexibility from Model's planning. The directive, phrased in the grandiose language typical of Hitler's orders, makes the situation clear. The Ruhr must be held at all costs. No retreat. Every metre of ground will be defended. The industrial region is vital to continued resistance and will be transformed into a fortress that breaks the enemy offensive. Model reads this order and understands its implications. He is not being asked to delay Allied advances while preserving his force for future operations. He is being commanded to sacrifice Army Group B in a static defense of terrain that cannot be held by the forces available. It is a death sentence phrased as a strategic directive. Model's meeting with his army commanders on March 16th reveals the gap between Hitler's fantasy orders and battlefield reality. Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, presents an honest assessment of his strength divisions, at 30 to 40% of authorized strength, critically short of anti-tank weapons, lacking the mobile reserves necessary for flexible defense. Von Zangen describes similar conditions in 15th Army, with the added complication that his formations must defend hilly terrain that favours defenders but requires troops he doesn't have to cover properly. The commanders don't need to state the obvious conclusion holding the Ruhr against a determined Allied attack is impossible with available forces. But Model doesn't discuss withdrawal or strategic retreat. His orders are clear, and his Prussian military tradition doesn't permit questioning the Führer's directives, no matter how divorced from reality they might be. A junior staff officer's diary entry from March 17th, discovered after the war, captures the atmosphere at Army Group B headquarters. The Field Marshal moves through headquarters like a man already dead, the officer writes. He studies maps, issues orders, maintains military discipline and proper procedures. But his eyes reveal knowledge. He cannot speak. We are being asked to perform the impossible. The troops sense it. The commanders know it. Even the Führer must understand it, somewhere behind the fantasy directives that arrive daily from Berlin. We will fight because we are soldiers and because retreat is forbidden, but we will lose. And the only question is how many of us will die in the process. Model's defensive planning proceeds despite, or perhaps because of, the Sidemo hopelessness of the strategic situation. He positions 5th Panzer Army to defend approaches north of the Ruhr, where flatter terrain favours mobile defence if mobile reserves existed. 15th Army receives orders to hold the hilly approaches from the south, using terrain to compensate for numerical weakness. Artillery positions are surveyed and registered. Supply dumps are dispersed to reduce vulnerability to air attack. Engineer units prepare bridges and key infrastructure for demolition. Every action reflects professional military competence applied to an insoluble problem. Model is organising the defence of the Ruhr with the thoroughness of a man preparing for an examination he knows he will fail. The human element in Model's calculations creates moral complexities that military planning cannot resolve. He commands 317,000 troops, most of them conscripts and recent recruits with minimal training. Many are teenagers, drafted in the desperate expansions of late 1944. Some are overage veterans recalled from reserve status, men in their 40s and 50s whose military experience dates to World War I. Mixed among them are foreign volunteers and conscripts from occupied territories, fighting for reasons ranging from ideological conviction to simple coercion. These men will be asked to fight for industrial cities most have never seen, defending a regime that has clearly lost the war, following orders that sentence them to death or captivity. Model doesn't discuss these realities in staff meetings, but they inform every calculation he makes. When he positions divisions and assigns sectors, he is deciding which units will be sacrificed first, which formations might survive the coming catastrophe, and how many thousands will die or surrender in the defence of Hitler's impossible fortress. The Ruhr Valley, viewed from Model's headquarters in mid-March 1945, looks less like a defensive strongpoint and more like a grave large enough to swallow an entire army group. March 24th, 1945, 0300 hours. The night sky north of the Rhine River transforms into daylight as 2,000 Allied artillery pieces open fire simultaneously. The bombardment for Operation Flashpoint 9th Army's assault crossing at Wesel represents the largest concentration of firepower on the Western Front since D-Day. Each gun crew has spent days registering targets, calculating trajectories, stockpiling ammunition for the barrage that will precede the river crossing. Now those calculations become reality as shells arc across the Rhine, impacting German defensive positions with mathematical precision and overwhelming violence. The ground shakes from the impacts. The air fills with the scream of shells and the thunder of explosions. For 30 minutes, the bombardment continues without pause, transforming the eastern bank of the Rhine into a landscape of fire and smoke. At 0400 hours, the first assault boats enter the water. Infantry from 9th Army divisions begin the crossing, rowing through darkness toward a shore that moments before erupted with artillery impacts. German defenders who survived the barrage emerged from shelters to find Americans already halfway across the river. Some positions return fire. Others surrender immediately, overwhelmed by the violence that has just shattered their positions. By 0600 hours, the first bridgehead is established. By noon on March 24th, engineers are assembling pontoon bridges to support armour and heavy vehicles. The Rhine, the great defensive barrier that German planners expected would delay Allied advances for weeks, has been crossed in hours. Supporting the ground assault, 17,000 paratroopers from the 17th Airborne Division dropped near Wesel in the largest single-day airborne operation since Market Garden. The sky fills with transport aircraft and gliders, delivering troops directly behind German lines to seize bridges, road junctions, and key terrain. Some units land precisely on target, others scatter across the drop zone, collecting themselves under fire. German anti-aircraft fire claims transport aircraft and gliders, but the overwhelming numbers make defence impossible. By late afternoon on March 24th, the bridgehead has expanded to 10 miles deep and 15 miles wide. 9th Army has torn open the Rhine defences and created the launch pad for the northern arm of the Ruhr Encirclement. The exploitation phase begins immediately. 2nd Armoured Division, hell on wheels, races through the bridgehead on March 25th, pushing east and southeast toward the industrial region. The division's combat commands bypass German strongpoints, leaving infantry to reduce them while armour continues advancing. This is mobile warfare, conducted at a pace the Wehrmacht once perfected, now being executed against German defenders who lack the resources to counter it. By March 29th, 2nd Armoured Division has covered 35 miles in 4 days, reaching Holton and threatening to unhinge the entire German defensive line north of the Ruhr. Lieutenant Colonel William Hamburg commands a tank battalion in 2nd Armoured Division's advance. His after-action reports, filed daily and preserved in National Archives records, document the chaos of German defences during this period. March 29. Advanced 22 miles with minimal contact, one report reads. No organised resistance encountered. German troops surrendering in groups of 20 to 50. Bypassed several company-sized units that showed no desire to engage. Fuel supply more limiting than enemy action. Another report from March 30th notes, reached phase line Delta ahead of schedule. Opposition consists of scattered infantry with small arms, no anti-tank weapons observed, prisoners report units abandoned by officers, no rations for 3 days, no orders except to delay enemy. The German 116th Panzer Division attempts a counterattack near Dorsten on March 30th, seeking to slow 2nd Armoured's advance. The division that once fought across France and Russia now assembles perhaps 20 tanks and 2 infantry battalions for this effort. American Tactical Air Support identifies the concentration before it reaches jumping-off positions. P-47 fighter bombers from 9th Air Force strike the assembly area, destroying or damaging half the German armour before the counterattack begins. The surviving panzers advance into prepared American positions, where tank destroyers and Shermans engage them at ranges where German armour advantages evaporate. Within 6 hours, the counterattack collapses. Survivors retreat east, abandoning equipment they cannot recover. The attempt to slow 9th Army's advance achieves nothing except confirming that German mobile reserves no longer possess the strength to influence operations. Behind the advancing armour, infantry divisions follow, clearing bypass positions and securing the lengthening supply lines. The 30th Infantry Division moves through Recklinghausen on March 31st, finding a city already partially abandoned by German defenders. Civilians emerge from basements and shelters, waving white flags, grateful the battle has moved past them. Some offer information about German positions. Others simply want food and reassurance that the occupation will be orderly. American military government teams, woefully understaffed for the territories being liberated, attempt to establish basic administration while the front lines race farther east daily. The advance rate accelerates as German cohesion disintegrates. Between March 28th and March 31st, 9th Army divisions averaged 12 miles per day, extraordinary progress through defended territory. German units attempt to establish defensive lines, but American intelligence identifies these positions before they're fully prepared, and tactical airstrikes disrupt German movements before defences can solidify. The critical Dorsten coal mining complex falls essentially intact on March 30th, denying Germany coal resources and providing 9th Army a symbolic victory. industrial objectives that strategic bombing failed to neutralize for 4 years are captured in hours of ground combat. German command structure north of the Ruhr shows visible signs of collapse during this phase. Radio intercepts reveal confusion about unit locations, contradictory orders from different headquarters, and commanders requesting permission to retreat being denied by superiors who lack accurate information about the front lines. Some formations continue fighting effectively despite the chaos, professional soldiers executing their duties even as the larger military structure fails around them. Others dissolve, with troops abandoning positions to seek food, safety, or simply to escape the relentless American advance. The variation in unit performance reflects the Wehrmacht's condition in March 1945, isolated pockets of competence within a military organization suffering systemic failure. By April 1st, 1945, the northern Pincer of the Ruhr Encirclement has advanced 70 miles in 8 days. 2nd Armoured Division approaches Lippstadt, the planned link-up point, with 1st Army driving from the south. Behind the advancing spearheads, 9th Army controls a corridor of German territory 30 miles wide, secured by infantry and artillery. German defenders still hold portions of the Ruhr Valley, but the northern approach has been compromised beyond recovery. The industrial fortress that Hitler ordered Model to defend is about to be surrounded, and the Wehrmacht formations, tasked with its protection, are discovering that orders to stand fast mean nothing against an enemy that can move faster, strike harder, and sustain operations indefinitely. The northern jaw of the trap has closed with shocking speed, revealing that German defensive capabilities in the west have deteriorated even more completely than Allied planners dared hope. March 25th, 1945. 1st Army's breakout from the Remagen bridgehead begins with none of the massive artillery preparation that marked 9th Army's Rhine crossing. The bridge captured on March 7th has been supporting operations for 18 days, expanding the bridgehead daily despite German attempts to destroy it with artillery, V2 rockets, and even combat swimmers carrying explosives. Now that bridgehead becomes the launching point for the southern arm of the Ruhr Encirclement. 3rd Armoured Division, Spearhead, leads the advance northeast toward the industrial region, following routes mapped during weeks of aerial reconnaissance and intelligence analysis. Unlike the northern Pincer advancing through relatively flat terrain, 1st Army faces a landscape that favours defenders' hills, forests, narrow river valleys, and road networks that channel armoured advances into predictable routes. The fighting at Siegburg, just east of the Rhine, demonstrates the difference between northern and southern sectors. German paratroopers from the 3rd Parachute Division defend the town with determination born of esprit de corps and training that emphasise fighting to the last round. These are not the demoralised conscripts, surrendering in groups north of the Ruhr. These are veteran soldiers who understand their situation is hopeless but fight anyway, holding key intersections and high ground with small unit tactics that delay American advances for hours at a cost of minutes. The battle for Siegburg lasts 3 days, March 25th through March 27th, requiring house-to-house fighting and artillery support that levels portions of the town. When American infantry finally secure Siegburg on March 27th, they've suffered casualties that make clear the southern route will be contested every mile. 3rd Armoured Division's drive through the Bergisches Land region between March 28th and March 30th reveals terrain that transforms modern warfare into something resembling combat from an earlier era. Narrow roads wind through hills covered in forest, limiting the number of vehicles that can advance simultaneously and creating ambush opportunities for German defenders with anti-tank weapons. Tank commanders accustomed to cross-country mobility find their Shermans confined to roads where mines and Panzerfausts turn every bend into potential disaster. The division advances, but at 7 to 8 miles per day rather than the 15 to 20 miles per day achieved by 2nd Armoured in the north. This isn't failure, it's the inevitable friction created when mechanised warfare encounters terrain that negates mechanical advantages. Task Force Richardson, a combined arms battalion from 3rd Armoured Division, experiences the chaos of this advance near Attendorn on March 29th. The task force rounds a curve in a narrow valley road and encounters a German supply column, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, staff cars attempting to move east away from the American advance. For a moment, both forces freeze in mutual surprise. Then American tank commanders open fire at point-blank range, destroying the lead vehicles and blocking the road. German troops scatter into the forests. Some surrender, others escape. The entire engagement lasts perhaps 10 minutes, yielding 200 prisoners, 30 destroyed vehicles, and confirmation that German logistics throughout the southern sector are in complete disarray. The column's manifest, recovered from a burning staff car, shows it was carrying fuel intended for units that likely no longer exist in organised form. The heaviest resistance comes from German units defending not industrial targets but escape routes. The 353rd Infantry Division, holding positions in the hills south of the Ruhr, fights with unexpected intensity during the last week of March. Intercepted radio traffic explains their motivation. These troops are attempting to keep open corridors through which other German units can retreat eastward before the encirclement closes. They're not fighting for Hitler's fortress concept. They're fighting to save fellow soldiers from the trap they can see closing. This defensive effort costs the 353rd Infantry Division 80% casualties between March 25th and March 31st, but it delays First Army's advance by critical hours that allow some German formations to escape. First Army casualties between March 25th and March 31st, total 2,400 killed, wounded, and missing 3 times the losses suffered by 9th Army advancing through the northern sector during the same period. These statistics don't reflect military failure. They reflect terrain, German defensive strategy, and the reality that some Wehrmacht units still possess the skill and will to fight effectively despite the broader military collapse. American commanders adjust tactics, increasing artillery support, employing tactical airstrikes more systematically, and accepting that the southern advance will proceed more slowly than the northern pincer. The encirclement doesn't require both arms to arrive simultaneously, it requires both arms to arrive. A captured document from German 63rd Corps headquarters, dated March 30th, provides insight into German command thinking during this period. The order, signed by the Corps commander, directs subordinate units to delay enemy advances while maintaining viability of eastern withdrawal routes for Corps and Army level formations. The phrasing is revealing. It doesn't order units to hold positions indefinitely or to defend the Ruhr at all costs. It acknowledges that withdrawal is inevitable and instructs commanders to facilitate that withdrawal while conducting fighting retreats. This represents local commanders acting on military common sense rather than Hitler's fantastical directives. It also represents a level of insubordination that would have resulted in courts-martial earlier in the war, but now reflects the Wehrmacht's institutional acceptance that the war is lost and survival matters more than obedience. By March 31st, First Army reconnaissance elements reached the approaches to Lippstadt, approximately 70 miles from their Remagen starting point. The advance has taken 7 days of continuous combat, consumed thousands of tons of ammunition, and cost American units casualties they can replace while inflicting losses on German defenders that cannot be made good. The terrain has slowed the southern pincer, but it hasn't stopped it. 3rd Armoured Division's lead elements are within miles of linking with 2nd Armoured Division advancing from the north. The 2 arms of the encirclement, launched from positions 70 miles apart and advancing through completely different terrain against varying levels of resistance, are about to meet with a precision that would have seemed impossible before the operation began. The contrasts between northern and southern advances reveal the complexity of modern military operations. 9th Army's rapid progress north of the Ruhr reflected weak German defences, favourable terrain, and the demoralisation of units that recognised the futility of continued resistance. 1st Army's slower but steady advance reflected stronger German resistance, difficult terrain, and the presence of Wehrmacht units still capable of professional military performance. Yet, both advances succeeded in their operational objectives. Both pincers reached their link-up point within days of planned schedules. Both advances demonstrated that American forces had achieved a level of operational competence that could overcome varying challenges through flexible tactics and overwhelming material superiority. The southern jaw of the trap, moving more slowly but just as inexorably as the northern jaw, was about to close on Army Group B and transform the Ruhr Valley into the largest pocket in Western Front history. April 1st, 1945. 1440 hours. A patrol from 3rd Armoured Division's 36th Armoured Infantry Regiment advances cautiously through the outskirts of Lippstadt, a town that has seen its share of war but nothing like the convergence about to occur. The patrol leader, a lieutenant whose name will appear in dozens of after-action reports, spots movement ahead, vehicles, troops. But are they German or American? Radio discipline breaks momentarily as excited voices confirm what reconnaissance has predicted for days. These aren't Germans. They're Americans from 2nd Armoured Division, the Northern Pincer, finally meeting the Southern Arm. Handshakes and backslapping follow, photographed by a Signal Corps cameraman who understands he's documenting history. The link-up is official at 1440 hours, April 1st, 1945. The Ruhr Pocket has been created. The immediate reports radioed to higher headquarters carry excitement mixed with uncertainty about what has just been accomplished. Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters receives confirmation of the link-up within minutes, and staff officers begin the careful work of mapping the pocket's dimensions. What emerges from their calculations is staggering, roughly 70 miles east to west, 50 miles north to south, encompassing approximately 4,000 square kilometers of German territory. Inside this area sit major industrial cities: Essen, Dortmund, Bochum, Düsseldorf, Wuppertal, Duisburg. Inside this pocket are the foundries and factories that have sustained German war production despite years of strategic bombing. And inside this pocket are German military forces whose numbers remain unknown but clearly substantial. Field Marshal Model's Army Group B headquarters receives the news through degrading radio communications and fragmentary reports from forward units. The realization arrives not as a single dramatic moment, but as accumulated evidence that the worst-case scenario has materialized. Communications with units in the western portions of Model's sector go silent. Reports from eastern formations describe American forces blocking withdrawal routes. Model's intelligence officers plot known American positions on situation maps and reach the inescapable conclusion Army Group B is surrounded. The industrial region Hitler ordered defended at all costs is now cut off from the rest of Germany, isolated behind American lines with no prospect of relief or resupply. The initial Allied intelligence estimates, compiled hastily as staff officers try to understand what they've captured, place German strength inside the pocket at approximately 150,000 troops. These estimates derive from pre-encirclement assessments of German divisions in the Ruhr sector, modified by reports of units that escaped eastward before the trap closed. The numbers seem large but manageable. 150,000 troops could be systematically reduced through aggressive offensive operations over several weeks. What Allied intelligence doesn't yet know is that their estimates are catastrophically wrong. The actual number of German military personnel now trapped inside the Ruhr Pocket exceeds 300,000, more than twice the estimated strength. This intelligence failure, ironically, works in favour of Allied operations. If planners knew they faced over 300,000 trapped Germans, they might reconsider the encirclement strategy or request significantly more forces to contain and reduce the pocket. The pocket's geography reveals why so many German troops became trapped. The encirclement encompasses not just combat divisions, but the entire logistical and administrative infrastructure that supports Army Group B. Supply depots, maintenance facilities, medical installations, training units, headquarters formations, all the personnel that transform divisions on paper into functioning military organisations are trapped inside the pocket. Additionally, thousands of miscellaneous troops who happened to be in the Ruhr region when the encirclement closed now find themselves cut off: soldiers on leave, troops in transit between assignments, convalescent personnel from hospitals, labour battalions, and security forces. The Ruhr Pocket contains not just Army Group B, but a complete cross-section of Wehrmacht organisation in the west. Model receives Hitler's response to the encirclement via radio message late on April 1st. The directive demonstrates the Führer's complete detachment from battlefield reality. Fortress Ruhr will be held, supply by air will be organised, breakout. To the east will be executed at the appropriate moment. The surrounded forces represent the core of future operations to restore the Western Front. Model reads this message and understands that no airlift capacity exists to supply over 300,000 troops the Luftwaffe can barely supply itself, let alone conduct a Stalingrad-scale aerial resupply operation. No breakout to the east is possible without mobile reserves, fuel, and ammunition that Army Group B doesn't possess. The message is fantasy, a delusional directive from a man whose grasp of military reality collapsed long ago. But it's also an order from the Supreme Commander, and Model's Prussian military heritage doesn't permit ignoring it. Within the pocket, individual German soldiers experience the encirclement through immediate, physical realities rather than strategic abstractions. A lieutenant in infantry division, positioned near Bochum, writes in his diary on the evening of April 1st, "Rumours all day that Americans have closed the circle. Conflicting orders: prepare to defend in place. Prepare to move east. Maintain readiness for breakout. Nobody knows what's actually happening. Rations cut again. Artillery ammunition rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. We just realised we're not defending the Ruhr anymore, we're trapped in it. The diary entry captures the confusion that pervades German forces as the reality of encirclement settles over formations accustomed to receiving clear orders and maintaining organizational coherence. American forces completing the encirclement face immediate decisions about how to proceed. The initial operational plan called for creating the pocket, but detailed planning for reducing it has been left to subordinate commanders who must now make tactical decisions with strategic consequences. Should American forces push aggressively into the pocket, fragmenting German resistance at the cost of urban combat casualties? Should they establish a defensive perimeter and wait for German forces to collapse from supply exhaustion? Should they offer surrender terms immediately or assume German commanders will fight regardless? These questions generate different answers from different commanders, leading to variations in approach that will characterize the pocket reduction over the next 3 weeks. Approximately 18 American divisions now surround the Ruhr Pocket, 9 from 9th Army north of the industrial region, 9 from 1st Army south and east of it. This represents overwhelming combat power positioned to compress and eliminate the pocket systematically. Yet the encirclement also creates challenges. Maintaining a perimeter around 4,000 square kilometers requires extensive troop deployments that limit the forces available for offensive operations. Coordinating attacks from multiple directions into a shrinking pocket demands communication and fire control to prevent friendly fire incidents. Managing the inevitable surrender of tens of thousands of German troops will strain prisoner-of-war processing systems designed for smaller numbers. The largest encirclement in Western Front history presents operational challenges that have no recent precedent in American military experience. The strategic situation on April 1st reveals the Ruhr encirclement's broader significance. While Army Group B sits trapped in the pocket, the rest of the Western Front has collapsed. American and British forces are racing across Germany with minimal opposition. The Rhine has been crossed at multiple points. German defensive lines exist only on maps in Berlin headquarters, bearing no relationship to actual troop dispositions. The encirclement of the Ruhr removes the last significant concentration of German combat power in the West, transforming the campaign from a series of battles into what resembles an enormous pursuit operation interrupted by scattered resistance. The war in Western Europe is effectively over. What remains is the slow process of destroying or capturing the remnants of Wehrmacht forces that continue fighting because surrender is forbidden, or because communication breakdown prevents commanders from understanding the futility of continued resistance. The Ruhr Pocket, created on April 1st through the successful link-up at Lippstadt, represents the Wehrmacht's last gasp in the West. Model's trapped army group will fight for 3 more weeks, but its strategic influence ended the moment the American pincers met. Everything that follows is aftermath, the mechanical process of reducing a pocket whose existence changes nothing about Germany's inevitable defeat, but will determine the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and millions of civilians caught inside the trap. April 2nd, 1945. Model's Situation Conference begins with a simple question from his Chief of Staff. How many troops does Army Group B actually command? The question seems straightforward, but obtaining accurate answers proves impossible. Division commanders report strengths based on outdated personnel returns. Communications with some formations have been lost entirely. Subordinate headquarters provide conflicting information. After hours of staff work, the conference produces an estimate that shocks even officers accustomed to Wehrmacht decline. Approximately 317,000 troops are trapped inside the Ruhr Pocket. This is not 317,000 combat infantrymen. This total includes rear area personnel, support troops, administrative staff, wounded soldiers in hospitals, and every person in German uniform within the pocket's boundaries. The number of effectives capable of sustained combat might be half that figure. But even acknowledging these limitations, Model commands more than twice the force Allied intelligence believes they've trapped. The composition of this trapped force reveals Wehrmacht organization in advanced states of decay. 21 divisions appear on the order of battle, but most exist at fractions of authorized strength. 5th Panzer Army, responsible for the northern sector, can field perhaps 12 divisions worth of actual combat power from the 15 divisions on paper. 15th Army in the south faces similar problems. Divisions that should number 12,000 troops might actually field 4,000. And many of those are recent conscripts with minimal training. Scattered throughout the pocket are remnants of elite formations that once defined Wehrmacht excellence. Panzer Lehr Division, reduced to perhaps 1,500 troops and a handful of tanks. Waffen SS units that still maintain discipline despite catastrophic losses, parachute divisions fighting as infantry because airborne operations belong to an earlier, more capable German military. April 3rd brings Hitler's detailed directive for breaking out of the Encirclement, a document so divorced from reality that Model's staff officers initially wonder if it's authentic. The directive orders a coordinated offensive to the east involving armoured thrusts supported by tactical air cover, with specific routes and objectives detailed down to regimental level. It presumes Army Group B possesses mobile reserves, fuel stocks, and Luftwaffe support that haven't existed for months. Model reads the directive and faces an impossible choice. Obedience to Hitler's orders requires attempting a breakout that will certainly fail and will consume in days the ammunition and fuel needed to sustain defence for weeks. Disobedience means admitting the war is lost and accepting responsibility for Army Group B's destruction. The Prussian military tradition that shaped Model's entire career offers no guidance for this situation. Loyalty and military competence have become mutually exclusive. Model's private conversation with his Chief of Staff on April 4th, reconstructed from post-war testimony, reveals a commander trapped by his own values. "We have 30 divisions on paper," Model says, gesturing at organisational charts that bear minimal relationship to combat power. Perhaps 12 divisions in reality. Fuel for 3 days of mobile operations, ammunition for 2 weeks of static defence, no air support, no prospect of resupply. And the Führer orders a breakout to save the Ruhr fortress. The Chief of Staff offers no response because no response exists. Both men understand that Army Group B is doomed, whether it attacks, defends, or attempts to surrender. The only variable is how many soldiers die before the inevitable conclusion. On April 4th, Model issues orders that constitute tacit admission of the situation's hopelessness. Rather than organising the breakout Hitler demands, Model directs Army Group B to establish a defensive perimeter around the pocket's shrinking boundaries. The order uses language about maintaining operational flexibility and preserving combat power for decisive moment. But every officer who reads it understands its actual meaning. Army Group B will defend in place until ammunition runs out, food exhausts, or American attacks fragment the pocket beyond coherent resistance. This represents insubordination disguised as tactical necessity, a field marshal ignoring direct orders from the supreme commander while maintaining the fiction of obedience. It's a performance characteristic of Wehrmacht leadership in the war's final months, professional soldiers executing their duties while privately acknowledging the futility of their efforts. The material situation inside the pocket deteriorates with mathematical precision that staff officers can calculate even if they cannot remedy. Army Group B's ammunition consumption during the first week of April averages 5 times the available supply. Artillery units receive orders to limit fire missions to prevent complete exhaustion before mid-April. Tank units, already reduced to perhaps 30 to 40 operational vehicles by April 4th, consume fuel reserves without replacement. The panzers that survived years of combat across Europe will soon become stationary pillboxes, their mobility sacrificed to fuel shortages. Medical supplies run critically short as hospitals fill with wounded from the encirclement battles and subsequent American probing attacks. Morphine, sulfur drugs, bandages, blood, plasma, all the material that makes modern military medicine possible exist in quantities adequate for perhaps 1 week of sustained combat. Intercepted German radio traffic during the first week of April reveals command confusion spreading throughout Army Group B's hierarchy. American signals intelligence units monitoring German communications document fragments of orders, counter-orders, requests for clarification, and commanders asking for guidance that never arrives. One intercept captures a division commander requesting permission to withdraw from an untenable position, only to be told by Corps headquarters that Model has forbidden all withdrawals. Another intercept records a logistics officer reporting that his supply depot has been ordered to support 3 different divisions simultaneously, despite having resources for perhaps 1. The Wehrmacht's famous organisational efficiency, the staff competence that enabled combined arms operations and coordinated manoeuvre, is collapsing under the strain of defending an indefensible position with inadequate resources. Operational tank strength provides the clearest metric of German combat power evaporating. On April 1st, Model commanded approximately 50 operational panzers scattered across Army Group B. By April 4th, that number has fallen to perhaps 30 or 40, with losses coming not from American action but from mechanical breakdown, fuel exhaustion, and the impossibility of battlefield recovery and repair. The panzer divisions that once spearheaded Wehrmacht offensives now husband their remaining vehicles like precious relics. Tank commanders receive orders to engage only when absolutely necessary, to avoid movement that consumes irreplaceable fuel, to preserve combat power for undefined future operations that grow less plausible daily. The psychological impact on troops accustomed to armour support cannot be quantified, but manifests in reduced morale and increased willingness to surrender when American attacks materialise. The Luftwaffe's absence compounds every other problem model faces. German forces fighting in the Ruhr Pocket do so without air reconnaissance, without tactical air support, without air superiority, and without any realistic prospect that the Luftwaffe will influence operations. American and British aircraft own the skies, conducting reconnaissance missions that track German movements, interdiction strikes that destroy supply vehicles, close air support missions that break up any German concentration, and psychological operations that drop leaflets urging surrender. German troops learn to move only at night, to disperse immediately upon stopping, to assume that any formation visible from above will be attacked within hours. This aerial siege is as effective as any ground operation in destroying Army Group B's cohesion and combat effectiveness. Radio communication with the outside world, initially sporadic, degrades further as American jamming intensifies and German radio equipment fails without replacement parts. By April 7th, Model can communicate with OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the Armed Forces High Command, only through unreliable radio links subject to American interception and jamming. Some division commanders inside the pocket have lost contact with Corps headquarters. Some regiments cannot reach their parent divisions. The Wehrmacht's communication networks, designed for mobile warfare across vast distances, prove fragile when subjected to American electronic warfare and the physical destruction of signal infrastructure. The command and control system that once coordinated Army Group operations is fragmenting into isolated headquarters, making decisions based on incomplete information and hoping subordinates receive their orders. By April 7th, 1 week after the encirclement closed, Model faces a situation that admits no military solution. Army Group B cannot break out. It lacks the mobility, firepower, and supplies necessary for offensive operations. It cannot defend indefinitely ammunition, and food will run out regardless of how skillfully positions are held. It cannot surrender without Model defying Hitler directly and accepting personal responsibility for the largest capitulation in Western Front history. The Field Marshal, who built his reputation as the Führer's most reliable problem solver, now presides over a problem that has no solution: commanding troops whose sacrifice will achieve nothing except postponing the inevitable by days or weeks. The Ruhr Pocket, conceived by Hitler as a fortress that would break Allied offensives, has become a death trap that will consume Army Group B while changing nothing about Germany's strategic collapse. Model knows this. His staff knows this. Increasingly, his soldiers know this. Yet, the Wehrmacht's institutional culture, the Prussian military tradition, and Hitler's explicit orders all demand that the doomed defense continue until some external force American attacks, material exhaustion, or complete moral collapse makes further resistance impossible. April 5th, 1945. The food queue in Essen stretches for 3 city blocks, civilians standing in cold drizzle waiting for rations that have been cut to 800 calories per person per day. Women, children, elderly men, the demographics of a city whose young adult males either fight in Wehrmacht formations or died in previous years of total war. The queue moves slowly as distribution officials weigh portions with precision born of scarcity. A loaf of bread must feed a family for 3 days. Potatoes, the staple that has sustained German civilians through years of blockade, now appear irregularly as transportation systems collapse. The woman at the front of the line, a mother of 3, whose husband disappeared on the Eastern Front in 1943, receives her ration and calculates immediately that it's insufficient. Her children are already showing signs of malnutrition. This week's allotment guarantees the symptoms will worsen. Inside the Ruhr Pocket, civilian suffering intensifies with each day the encirclement persists. 3.5 million people require food, water, shelter, and basic services that depended on networks now severed by American forces. Before the encirclement, the Ruhr imported food from agricultural regions to the east. Those supply lines no longer exist. Before the encirclement, Coal from Ruhr mines powered electrical generation across Western Germany and was exported in exchange for food imports. That exchange system has ceased functioning. The pocket contains some of the most productive industrial land in Europe, but minimal agricultural capacity. It can manufacture steel but cannot grow wheat. The equation is simple and catastrophic. Millions of people trapped in an industrialized region that cannot feed itself, cut off from external supply, watching daily rations shrink towards starvation levels. A German soldier's letter, written on April 8th and never sent because postal services no longer function, captures the military experience inside the pocket from a private's perspective. "We have received no ammunition resupply since the Americans closed the ring," the letter reads. "Each man conserves rounds like they are made of gold. Our company commander says we have rations for 2 more weeks if we're careful. Nobody believes we'll be resupplied. The officers don't talk about breakout or relief anymore. We defend positions and wait for Americans who have unlimited ammunition and food while we count bullets and eat less each day. Some men say we should surrender. Others say we'll be shot if we try. Everyone is hungry all the time." The letter, found by American troops after the pocket's collapse, resides now in archives as testimony to the human reality of military encirclement. Dortmund's municipal hospital system on April 8th illustrates the humanitarian catastrophe developing inside the pocket. The city's 3 major hospitals, designed to serve a peacetime population with capacity for wartime expansion, now struggle with patient loads that exceed all planning assumptions. Military wounded from the encirclement battles fill surgical wards. Civilian casualties from American artillery strikes and tactical air attacks overflow trauma capacity. Refugees from western portions of the pocket, fleeing combat zones, arrive sick and malnourished. The hospitals lack adequate medical supplies, morphine for pain relief, sulfur drugs for infection control, blood plasma for trauma surgery, bandages for wound care. Doctors perform amputations without anesthesia. Nurses ration antibiotics to the patients most likely to survive. The hospital administration has calculated that current medical supply stocks will be exhausted by April 15th, after which medical care reverts to 19th century standards. The Volkssturm, Germany's home guard militia composed of males too young or too old for regular Wehrmacht service, embodies the desperation of German defensive efforts. In Bochum, on April 10th, a Volkssturm unit assembles for deployment to defensive positions on the city's western outskirts. The unit comprises 57 men, ranging in age from 15 to 63. They carry a mixture of rifles dating to World War I, a handful of Panzerfausts for anti-tank defence, and 5 rounds of ammunition per man. Their training consisted of 2 afternoons of drill and basic weapons familiarisation. Their uniforms are improvised armbands, identifying them as German forces, civilian clothes otherwise. They receive orders to hold a sector of the defensive perimeter against American attacks that, when they come, will be supported by artillery, armour, and tactical air power. The Volkssturm commander, a veteran of the First World War who understands military realities, knows his unit will dissolve under serious attack. He deploys them anyway because orders are orders and because refusing means execution for defeatism. Daily food consumption versus available supplies creates arithmetic that approaches catastrophe by mid-April. The pocket's civilian population of 3.5 million requires roughly 3,500 tonnes of food daily to maintain even minimal caloric intake. Agricultural production within the pocket, disrupted by combat and lacking seasonal farm labour, contributes perhaps 300 tonnes daily. Stored food supplies, depleted by years of rationing and Allied bombing, can sustain current consumption rates for perhaps 18 days from the encirclement date. This calculation means that by April 20th, civilian food supplies will be exhausted regardless of military outcomes. Wehrmacht forces add additional consumption pressure, 317,000 troops requiring roughly 600 tonnes of food daily. The combined civilian and military food requirements exceed available supplies by an 18-day deficit that no amount of rationing can overcome. Starvation is approaching not as metaphor but as mathematical certainty. Water infrastructure damage compounds a supply crisis. Allied bombing campaigns throughout 1944 and early 1945 damaged approximately 40% of the Ruhr's water treatment and distribution systems. Before the encirclement, repair crews maintained basic service through constant maintenance and improvisation. After the encirclement, spare parts become unavailable, skilled workers are conscripted for military labour, and American artillery strikes damage additional infrastructure. By early April, Entire neighborhoods in major cities lack running water. Civilians queue at emergency distribution points where tanker trucks provide minimal daily allotments. Disease risk increases as sanitation systems fail. Typhus cases begin appearing in Essen and Dortmund, the infections spreading through overcrowded refugee centers where malnourished populations lack resistance to communicable disease. Military desertion accelerates as soldiers recognize the hopelessness of their situation. Precise numbers are impossible to determine, but German military police reports and post-war analysis suggest desertion rates of 5 to 8% daily throughout the pocket by mid-April. Some deserters shed uniforms and attempt to blend into civilian populations. Others hide in bombed buildings or forests, waiting for American forces to overrun their positions so they can surrender without being shot by German military police. Still others form small bands that survive through petty theft from military supply depots or civilian homes. The Wehrmacht's discipline, legendary for its harshness and effectiveness, begins fragmenting under the combination of starvation, military futility, and the visceral human desire to survive. SS security forces respond to this erosion with terror. Beginning around April 10th, military police and SS units begin executing soldiers accused of defeatism, desertion, or spreading rumors that undermine morale. The executions are public when possible, bodies left hanging from lampposts with signs identifying the crime that resulted in death. In some towns, Wehrmacht officers order these bodies removed, objecting to the psychological impact on remaining troops. In other locations, SS officers insist the displays continue as deterrent. The disagreement reveals the fracturing of German command authority inside the pocket, different organizations pursuing conflicting strategies, united only by the fiction that Army Group B remains a coherent fighting force rather than a trapped mass of increasingly desperate men. Refugee movements inside the pocket create additional chaos. Approximately 200,000 civilians flee from western sectors as American attacks intensify, moving east toward areas they believe offer greater safety. This internal displacement overwhelms towns unprepared to house and feed sudden population influxes. Refugees camp in schools, churches, public buildings, anywhere offering shelter. They arrive with minimal possessions, no food reserves, and desperate need for resources the pocket cannot provide. Local officials attempt to register refugees, establish feeding centres, and maintain basic order while their own administrative systems collapse from overload. The refugee crisis inside the Ruhr Pocket becomes a humanitarian emergency within a humanitarian emergency. Layers of suffering compounding until relief seems impossible and survival becomes a daily calculation rather than an assumption. By April 10th, 10 days after the encirclement closed, life inside the Ruhr Pocket has deteriorated from difficult to desperate. Civilians face starvation on a timeline measured in days. Soldiers confront military futility while being threatened with execution for acknowledging reality. Water systems fail, medical care collapses, administrative order fractures. The industrial heart of Nazi Germany, the region Hitler declared would be defended as an impregnable fortress, has become a cauldron of human suffering where millions of people trapped by geography and military circumstance wait for liberation, conquest, or death. The distinction between those outcomes grows less clear each day. As American forces prepare to reduce the pocket through systematic military pressure that will inevitably increase civilian casualties while destroying the Wehrmacht formations whose presence justifies continued combat. The Ruhr has become a prison 60 miles across, its walls formed by American divisions, its inmates a mixture of soldiers, civilians, and refugees who share only the knowledge that their situation grows worse with each passing day and that escape is impossible. April 6th, 1945. Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters at Wiesbaden hosts a planning conference that will determine the Ruhr Pocket's fate. Senior commanders from 1st and 9th Armies, along with corps and division leaders, study maps showing the encirclement's current dimensions. The strategic question is straightforward. How do you systematically reduce a pocket containing over 300,000 enemy troops and 3.5 million civilians while minimizing American casualties and maintaining operational momentum? The answer that emerges from this conference reflects American military doctrine adapted to unprecedented circumstances: divide the pocket into smaller segments, compress those segments simultaneously through coordinated attacks, and apply overwhelming firepower to break German resistance while offering surrender as a constant alternative to destruction. The division strategy calls for splitting the pocket along the Ruhr River. which runs roughly east-west through the industrial region. North of the river, 9th Army will assume responsibility for approximately 150,000 trapped German troops and the cities of Duisburg, Essen, and northern Dortmund. South of the river, 1st Army will compress southern portions of the pocket containing approximately 167,000 Germans and cities including Düsseldorf, Wuppertal, and Bochum. This geographic division allows each army to focus on manageable objectives while maintaining clear boundaries that prevent friendly fire incidents. The strategy acknowledges that reducing the pocket will require weeks of sustained operations, urban combat, and the processing of tens of thousands of prisoners as German resistance inevitably fragments. April 8th brings the first major application of this strategy, the artillery bombardment of Hagen, a city of 180,000 in the southern portion of the pocket. American artillery doctrine emphasizes massed fires to suppress enemy positions before infantry assault. At Hagen, doctrine becomes devastating reality. 2,000 artillery shells impact the city in 90 minutes, targeting identified German defensive positions, command posts, and communication nodes. The bombardment transforms entire city blocks into rubble, destroys buildings that survived years of strategic bombing, and creates the psychological shock that precedes infantry assault. German defenders who survive the barrage emerge from cellars and bunkers to find their positions destroyed, and American infantry already approaching through the smoke and dust. The assault on Soest, April 7th through 9th, demonstrates the human cost of systematic reduction even when the outcome is predetermined. The city sits in the southern pocket's eastern extremity, defended by elements of 3 German divisions whose combined strength might equal 1 full-strength regiment. American intelligence knows the defenders are weak, disorganized, and poorly supplied. The city could probably be bypassed, left to wither as the pocket contracts. But doctrine calls for systematic reduction to prevent German forces from concentrating, and systematic reduction means Soest must be taken. The battle unfolds as house-to-house fighting, infantry from the 8th Infantry Division clearing buildings room by room while engineers demolish structures that might harbour defenders. German resistance varies from determined defence by small units to immediate surrender by troops grateful for excuse to stop fighting. After 3 days, Soest falls, yielding 800 prisoners and costing Americans 43 killed, 190 wounded. Reconnaissance patrols throughout the pocket's perimeter between April 8th and 10th report a phenomenon that complicates military planning, white flags appearing in increasing numbers. German soldiers, squad-sized groups, even entire companies, emerge from positions carrying improvised white flags, attempting to surrender rather than fight. Some units negotiate surrenders through local civilians who contact American forces. Others simply abandon positions and walk toward American lines with hands raised. The surrender rate accelerates from hundreds daily to thousands, creating processing problems for prisoner-of-war systems designed for smaller numbers. 9th Army establishes collection points where German prisoners are searched, documented, and transported to rear area camps. The system functions but strains under volume that exceeds all planning assumptions. American battalion commanders throughout the pocket face ethical and tactical dilemmas that military training inadequately addressed. When civilians intermingle with retreating German troops, how do you engage military targets without causing civilian casualties? When a German unit offers to surrender but SS security forces in the same town execute deserters, do you accept the surrender or demand the entire garrison capitulate? When artillery observers identify German positions in residential neighborhoods, do you call fire missions that will destroy homes and kill civilians who cannot evacuate? These questions generate different answers from different commanders, creating variations in approach that range from aggressive prosecution of attacks regardless of civilian presence to deliberate efforts to minimize collateral damage, even at cost of slower advances. The artillery ammunition expenditure between April 6th and 12th reveals the material scale of pocket reduction. American forces fire approximately 250,000 artillery rounds during this week, an average of 35,000 shells per day. Each round must be transported from ammunition dumps to firing positions fired by gun crews working in shifts and replaced through supply chains extending back to ports on the French coast. The logistical achievement of sustaining this fire volume receives no headlines, but it represents the organizational competence that separates American forces from German defenders who must ration artillery rounds because replacement is impossible. American guns can fire as much as tactical situations require. German guns must conserve ammunition for crises, making every fire mission a calculation of whether the target justifies irreplaceable shells. Surrender rates provide the clearest metric of German morale collapse. By April 10th, approximately 3,000 to 5,000 German troops surrendered daily across the pocket's perimeter. These aren't casualties from combat, these are soldiers who walk into captivity rather than continue fighting. Post-war interviews with prisoners reveal consistent patterns. Many describe weeks without adequate food. Almost all report ammunition shortages that made defense impossible. Some mention officers who abandoned units or committed suicide rather than continue hopeless resistance. Others describe simply waiting for Americans to arrive, so surrender became possible without being shot by German military police. The surrender wave represents not cowardice, but rational calculation by soldiers who recognize military realities more clearly than their high command. American tactical air operations intensify throughout the pocket reduction, exploiting weather improvements and air superiority so complete that Luftwaffe interference is non-existent. P-47 fighter bombers from 9th Air Force conduct armed reconnaissance missions, attacking any German vehicles or troop concentrations identified through aerial observation. Medium bombers strike identified headquarters locations, supply dumps, and communication centers. The psychological impact on German troops equals the physical damage. Constant aerial surveillance makes movement nearly impossible during daylight, forces all logistics operations to nighttime hours, and creates pervasive sense that American forces see everything and can strike anywhere. German soldiers learn to disperse immediately upon stopping, to avoid concentrating in groups larger than squad size, and to accept that the sky itself is hostile territory. By April 12th, the pocket reduction has established patterns that will continue until German resistance collapses completely. American forces compress the perimeter through coordinated attacks supported by overwhelming artillery and air power. German forces defend when positioned units resist, surrender when morale fails, or simply dissolve as desertion accelerates. Civilian casualties mount as combat spreads through urban areas where separation between military and civilian populations is impossible. The humanitarian crisis intensifies as food supplies exhaust and water systems fail. The Ruhr Pocket is being systematically destroyed, not through single climactic battle, but through relentless application of military pressure that German defenders cannot counter and can only endure until endurance itself becomes impossible. The question is no longer whether the pocket will be eliminated, but when and at what cost in lives, German and American, military and civilian, all trapped in a 60-mile circle of industrial devastation where war grinds forward with mechanical inevitability toward an outcome everyone can foresee but nobody can prevent. April 10th, 1945. Dawn breaks over Essen, revealing a city that has endured 5 years of strategic bombing, but nothing resembling the assault about to begin. The Krupp Steelworks, target of countless RAF raids, sprawls across the eastern districts, a vast industrial complex of foundries, machine shops, and assembly halls that employed tens of thousands before the war. Now German defenders have transformed this industrial landscape into a fortress, positioning machine gun nests in blast furnaces, establishing observation posts in factory chimneys, creating defensive positions among the machinery that once produced Tiger tanks and artillery pieces. The 95th Infantry Division, tasked with capturing Essen, studies aerial photographs showing the Krupp works stretching across 2 square miles of urban territory. Every building could hide defenders. Every smokeless chimney could conceal snipers. The industrial complex that symbolized German military-industrial power will become a battlefield where Americans must fight building by building through structures designed for manufacturing, not combat. The battle for Essen begins at 0600 hours on April 10th, with artillery preparation targeting identified German positions throughout the city for 2 hours. American guns pound defensive works, command posts, and strong points mapped through aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogation. The bombardment walks systematically through Essen's eastern districts, each impact adding to destruction accumulated through 5 years of strategic bombing. When infantry advances at 0800 hours, they enter a landscape of rubble, craters, and partially collapsed buildings where the line between bomb damage and artillery damage has ceased to exist. German resistance emerges from this devastation, machine gun positions that survive the barrage, infantry in cellars firing through rubble, Panzerfausts engaging American armor from destroyed buildings. The defenders are outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from resupply. But they occupy terrain that favours defence and seems willing to fight for every city block. The Krupp Works battle, April 10th through 12th, demonstrates urban combat's brutal arithmetic. American infantry advance through the industrial complex at rates measured in yards per hour rather than miles per day. Each building requires careful approach, reconnaissance to identify firing positions, suppressive fire to keep defenders down, assault teams breaching walls or entering through bomb damage, room by room clearing with grenades and rifle fire. German defenders use the industrial architecture skillfully, falling back through connecting buildings, using machinery for cover, creating kill zones where American troops must expose themselves to advance. A machine shop becomes fortress. A furnace building becomes strongpoint. An administrative block becomes final defensive position where surrounded Germans choose between surrender and death. Casualty figures from the Essen battle reflect the cost of taking defended urban terrain. The 95th Infantry Division suffers 217 casualties, 41 killed, 163 wounded, 13 missing during the three-day battle. German casualties, more difficult to calculate, but estimated from prisoner counts and bodies recovered, total approximately 800, perhaps 250 killed, 300 wounded, and 350 captured. The exchange ratio favours Americans as firepower advantages and air support allow suppression of German positions with minimal exposure. But the American casualties, modest by World War II standards, represent families receiving telegrams, hospitals treating wounded, and the grinding cost of urban combat that continues day after day across multiple cities. Wuppertal's capture on April 14th provides stark contrast to Essen's battle. The city of 400,000 sits in hilly terrain in the southern pocket, defended by elements of a Volkssturm battalion and scattered Wehrmacht stragglers. As elements of the 78th Infantry Division approach Wuppertal's outskirts on April 13th, they encounter civilian emissaries carrying white flags and messages from the city's mayor. The mayor, a Nazi Party appointee who nevertheless prioritizes civilian survival over ideological commitment, has negotiated with local Wehrmacht commanders to declare Wuppertal an open city. German military forces have withdrawn from urban areas. Defensive positions have been abandoned. The mayor requests American forces enter peacefully to prevent house-to-house fighting that would devastate what Allied bombing has left intact. The decision to accept Wuppertal's surrender creates command dilemmas resolved at division level. Does accepting surrender from a mayor rather than military commander establish dangerous precedent? Do German troops withdrawing from Wuppertal reinforce defences elsewhere, prolonging the pocket's resistance? Division Commander Brigadier General Edwin Parker weighs these concerns against the certain civilian casualties if Wuppertal is taken by assault and decides pragmatism outweighs military formality. On April 14th, American troops enter Wuppertal without firing a shot, find the city largely intact by Ruhr standards, and begin occupation duties while combat continues in cities 20 miles away. The mayor who arranged this surrender disappears from historical record. Whether he was later executed by SS security forces, survived the war, or fled remains unknown. His decision saves Wuppertal from becoming another Essen. Dortmund, April 13th, presents the war's grotesque finale. Hitler, youth teenagers, fighting American armour with fanaticism born of indoctrination and ignorance. The Dortmund suburbs on the city's western edge house defensive positions manned by boys aged 14 to 17, members of the Hitler Youth Organization, given military training and Panzerfausts then deployed as infantry. Their commanders are SS officers and Nazi Party officials who speak of final victory and the Führer's secret weapons while positioning children in defensive lines. When American tanks from the 95th Infantry Division approach these positions on April 13th, the teenagers open fire with weapons they barely know how to operate, achieving nothing except their own destruction. American tank crews, initially confused by the ineffective fire, realize they're engaging children and face immediate moral crisis. These are enemy combatants firing anti-tank weapons, making them legitimate targets. But they're also clearly boys who should be in school rather than combat. The Hitler Youth engagement lasts perhaps 90 minutes before adult Wehrmacht officers in adjacent positions negotiate surrender of the surviving teenagers. Of roughly 80 boys deployed in this sector, approximately 30 are killed, 20 wounded, and 30 surrender. American after-action reports describe the engagement with visible discomfort. One tank commander writes, "Engaged enemy infantry positions, discovered defenders were kids, maybe 15 years old. Complete waste." The incident captures Nazism's moral bankruptcy in miniature regime. So, bankrupt, it sends children to die in hopeless battles while calling this defense of the fatherland. The surviving Hitler youth are processed as prisoners of war, photographed by Signal Corps cameramen documenting the war's absurdities, and eventually released to whatever families still exist. Their story becomes footnote in larger narratives, but represents tragedy that multiplies across the pocket's final weeks, young lives destroyed for a regime that was already defeated. German officers surrendering units at Bochum on April 15th provide testimony to the Wehrmacht's institutional collapse. A battalion commander from the 353rd Infantry Division approaches American lines under white flag, accompanied by two subordinate officers. Through an interpreter, he explains his situation with clinical precision. "We have no food. We have no ammunition. We have no orders except to defend. We have no reason to die. I am surrendering my battalion of 437 men. We have 53 wounded who require medical attention. We request treatment according to Geneva Convention." The American company commander accepting this surrender radios his battalion for instructions, receives authorization to process the prisoners, and watches as 437 German soldiers emerge from defensive positions with relief visible on faces that show weeks of inadequate rations and constant stress. This surrender pattern replicates across the pocket throughout mid-April. German commanders at battalion and regimental level recognise the futility of continued resistance and seek ways to surrender that protect their honour while saving their men's lives. Some negotiate through civilian intermediaries. Others send emissaries under white flag. A few simply cease fighting and wait for American forces to overrun positions without resistance. The variations reflect individual command decisions rather than coordinated strategy. Army Group B headquarters has ceased functioning as coherent command authority, leaving trapped formations to make independent choices about whether to fight or surrender. Most choose surrender when opportunity presents, creating cascading collapse as each capitulation makes continued resistance by adjacent units increasingly pointless. Civilian emergence from cellars and shelters accompanies each city's capture, revealing populations that have endured weeks of combat without adequate food, water, or medical care. In Bochum, American troops find families that have sheltered in basements for 10 days, emerging pale and malnourished into daylight they haven't seen since the pocket reduction began. In Essen, refugees from western districts arrive at American distribution points with children showing clear signs of malnutrition and elderly suffering from dehydration. In Dortmund, hospitals overflow with civilian casualties, from artillery strikes and building collapses, many dying from treatable injuries because medical supplies exhausted days earlier. The humanitarian crisis that developed inside the pocket becomes visible as American forces penetrate urban areas, document conditions through photographs and reports, and begin emergency relief efforts that military government teams are woefully unprepared to manage. Infrastructure destruction across the captured cities reveals the cumulative impact of 5 years of strategic bombing compounded by 3 weeks of tactical combat. Essen's capture on April 12 gives American engineers access to industrial facilities that sustained German war production despite relentless air attack. Their assessment is devastating. Approximately 65% of the Krupp works is damaged beyond immediate repair, with furnaces destroyed, machine tools wrecked, and buildings collapsed. Dortmund's coal mines, captured on April 13th, show similar damage, some shafts flooded, others collapsed, essential equipment destroyed or removed by retreating Germans. Across the industrial region, the infrastructure that made the Ruhr vital to German resistance lies in ruins. Whether this destruction resulted from Allied bombing, German demolitions, or combat damage matters less than the reality that the industrial heart of Nazi Germany has been destroyed in the process of capturing it. By April 17th, when Düsseldorf falls largely intact after minimal resistance, the pattern of city captures has established itself clearly. Some cities fight Essen, Dortmund, Bochum, costing American casualties and German lives in battles whose outcomes were never in doubt. Other cities surrender Wuppertal, Düsseldorf, sparing themselves destruction in exchange for occupation that will come regardless. The variation reflects local command decisions, civilian pressure on military authorities, and the Wehrmacht's fragmenting discipline as subordinate commanders prioritize survival over continued futile resistance. The cities of the Ruhr fall one by one, each capture shrinking the pocket's dimensions, each surrender adding thousands to prison accounts that have exceeded all planning estimates. The industrial region Hitler declared would be defended as fortress is being systematically conquered, not through single climactic battle, but through relentless compression that continues until German resistance simply ceases because continuing has become physically impossible. April 14th, 1945. American intelligence officers at 1st Army Headquarters update their situation map with information that reveals the Ruhr Pocket's transformation from coherent defensive position to chaotic fragmentation. The map, covered with symbols representing known German units, shows the pocket split into over 30 isolated zones, each cut off from others, each making independent decisions about resistance or surrender. The continuous defensive perimeter that existed on April 1st has disintegrated into scattered strongpoints, bypassed formations, and units that continue fighting because they don't know the larger battle has been lost. German command and control, never robust after the encirclement, has collapsed entirely. Model's Army Group B headquarters can communicate with perhaps a third of its subordinate formations. Corps headquarters have lost contact with division commanders. Regimental officers issue orders to battalions that may no longer exist or may have surrendered hours earlier. The Wehrmacht's famous organizational discipline, the staff system that coordinated operations across continental distances, has fragmented into isolated commanders making tactical decisions based on local knowledge and personal judgment. The 116th Panzer Division's remnants near Hagen embody this fragmentation. Once a frontline formation that fought across France and Russia, the division now comprises approximately 200 men, 3 operational tanks, and supplies adequate for perhaps 2 days. On April 14th, the division commander, a colonel who took command after the previous commander was killed in January, assembles his officers and conducts what amounts to a referendum on continued resistance. The options are stark. Attempt to break through American lines toward the east, defend current positions until ammunition exhausts, or surrender as a formed unit. The officers vote. The result is nearly unanimous surrender. The colonel negotiates terms with the nearest American unit, and on April 15th, the 116th Panzer Division formally capitulates, its soldiers marching into captivity in formation, maintaining military discipline to the end, even as they acknowledge the futility of further resistance. Paratrooper units in the Sauerland forests southeast of the main industrial areas continue fighting despite isolation that should make resistance impossible. These are elite troops, many veterans of Crete, Russia and Normandy, indoctrinated with esprit de corps that makes surrender almost unthinkable. They've withdrawn from urban areas into forested hills, where American mechanized forces cannot easily pursue, establishing defensive positions around small towns and road junctions. Their supply situation is catastrophic, no food except what they can forage or take from civilians, no ammunition resupply, no communication with higher command. Yet they continue small-scale resistance, ambushing American patrols, mining roads, defending positions when attacked. Some fight from ideological conviction. Others from unit loyalty, refusal to abandon comrades or dishonor their regiment. Still others simply because fighting is what they know, and surrender means admitting that years of combat accomplished nothing except their own survival. Radio intercepts during mid-April document the confusion pervading German command networks. American signals intelligence units monitoring German frequencies record fragments of communication that reveal systemic breakdown. One intercept captures a regimental commander requesting orders from division headquarters, receiving no response, then attempting to contact corps headquarters with similar failure. Another intercept records a supply officer asking for ammunition resupply, being told by logistics command that resupply is impossible, then asking permission to surrender his depot to prevent capture. The permission is denied by an officer who likely lacks authority to grant it, and certainly lacks means to prevent it. A third intercept, later analysed for insight into German morale, records a company commander asking battalion headquarters, "What is the point? We have no ammunition, no food, no orders. May we surrender?" The response crackles through static. The Führer orders resistance. Model orders resistance. You will resist. The company commander's final transmission, understood, out. Some German formations continue fighting effectively despite systemic collapse around them. Professional soldiers execute their duties even as larger military structures fail, maintaining discipline and combat effectiveness through small unit leadership and institutional competence. An SS Panzer Grenadier battalion near Attendorn holds a critical road junction for 4 days, April 12th through 15th, against repeated American attacks, withdrawing only when flanking movements threaten encirclement. A Wehrmacht infantry regiment in the Sauerland conducts a textbook fighting withdrawal over 3 days, using terrain skillfully to delay American advances while preserving unit cohesion. These examples of continued competence make the larger collapse more striking through contrast. Isolated units still fight as professionals, while the Wehrmacht as an institution disintegrates around them. The peak surrender rate, April 14th through 16th, sees 15,000 to 20,000 German troops per day entering American captivity. These numbers exceed prisoner processing capacity by factors of 5 or 10, creating improvised holding areas where Germans wait for transportation to establish POW camps. Fields near Lippstadt become temporary prisoner compounds, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by soldiers diverted from combat duties. German officers attempt to maintain organization among prisoners, establishing internal discipline and distributing food when American logistics makes provisions available. The scene resembles armies surrendering after conventional battles, except this surrender occurs continuously over days, with new groups arriving hourly, creating administrative chaos that military government teams struggle to manage. Still resisting on April 15th are approximately 50,000 German troops in scattered groups throughout the pocket's shrinking boundaries. Some occupy defensive positions in cities not yet captured. Others have withdrawn to forested areas where tracked vehicles cannot easily pursue. Some are cut-off formations that continue fighting because they lack information about the larger situation. Others are units whose commanders refuse surrender regardless of circumstances, driving subordinates forward through combination of discipline, ideology, and threat of execution for defeatism. The variation in resistance reflects the Wehrmacht's condition in April 1945, pockets of continued effectiveness within an organization experiencing institutional death. American strategy shifts subtly during this fragmentation phase. Rather than reducing every German position through direct assault, commanders increasingly bypass resistance, accepting mass surrenders when offered, and consolidating control of captured territory. The goal is no longer destroying German combat power that's occurring through attrition and surrender without American action required. The goal is managing the pocket's collapse to minimize American casualties while preventing humanitarian disaster among trapped civilian populations. This shift from combat operations to occupation duties challenges military units trained for warfare, not governance, creating friction as combat soldiers must transform into military police, administrators, and humanitarian workers. Radio communication between Model's headquarters and remaining German units provides insight into the Field Marshal's mental state as his command disintegrates. Intercepts from April 15th record, Model attempting to issue orders to divisions that probably no longer exist as coherent formations, directing defensive positions that have been bypassed or captured, and promising resupply that everyone knows cannot arrive. Some intercepts suggest Model understands the futility of his directives but continues issuing them from institutional habit or psychological need to maintain command pretense. Other intercepts reveal genuine delusion, Model speaking of counterattacks and breakouts as though Army Group B retains offensive capability. The intercepts paint portrait of a commander watching his command evaporate while maintaining fiction of control through radio messages that increasingly resemble theatre rather than military orders. Prisoner interrogations throughout mid-April reveal common themes among surrendering Germans. Most describe weeks of inadequate food, culminating in near starvation by the time they surrendered. Almost all report ammunition exhaustion that made defence impossible even if desired. Many mention officers who abandoned units or committed suicide rather than face surrender. Some describe simply waiting for Americans to arrive, viewing captivity as relief from impossible military situation. Few express ideological commitment to continued resistance. Most frame surrender as practical necessity rather than political choice. The interrogation reports, compiled into intelligence summaries, document Wehrmacht morale collapse, but also reveal that most German soldiers viewed their military service as duty rather than crusade, making surrender psychologically acceptable once military situation became obviously hopeless. By April 16th, the Ruhr Pocket has been reduced from 4,000 square kilometres to approximately 1,200 square kilometres, a shrinkage of 70% in 16 days. The systematic compression has fragmented German resistance into isolated pockets that lack communication, coordination, and realistic prospect of affecting the battle's outcome. American forces control all major cities except a few holdouts in eastern districts. Prisoner counts exceed 250,000, with thousands more surrendering daily. The Wehrmacht formations that entered the pocket with organizational structure and command hierarchy now exist as scattered groups making local decisions about how long to continue resistance. That changes nothing about Germany's strategic collapse. The largest encirclement in Western Front. History is approaching its conclusion, not through single climactic surrender, but through progressive fragmentation that continues until organized resistance simply ceases because the organization required to coordinate it no longer exists. April 17th, 1945. Field Marshal Walter Model's final headquarters sits concealed in woods near Duisburg, surrounded by 500 troops whose loyalty remains unshaken despite Army Group B's visible disintegration. The headquarters occupies a forester's lodge, camouflaged against aerial observation, connected to the outside world by radio links that function intermittently when American jamming permits. Model moves through the rooms like a man performing duties while knowing they're meaningless, maintaining military routine while the military organization he commands ceases to exist. Staff officers compile reports, documenting units that no longer respond to communications. Operations planners draft orders for formations that have probably surrendered. Intelligence officers brief Model on American movements that clearly demonstrate the pocket's systematic reduction. The headquarters functions because military organizations function until they don't, continuing through institutional momentum even when strategic purpose has evaporated. Model's conversation with General Fritz Bayerlein on April 17th, reconstructed from Bayerlein's post-war testimony, reveals a commander confronting the futility of continued resistance without abandoning the military values that defined his career. What's the point of continuing? Bayerlein asks, speaking with the bluntness of exhaustion and despair. Model responds not with defiance or fantasy, but with philosophical resignation. The point is that we're soldiers. We follow orders until we cannot. Hitler has ordered defense of the Ruhr. That order stands until circumstances make obedience impossible, or until I receive different orders. Bayerlein presses. The circumstances are already impossible. Most of Army Group B has surrendered or will surrender within days. We cannot affect the war's outcome. We can only choose how this ends. Model's response carries awareness of the choice he's already made. I know. Everyone knows. But a field marshal doesn't become a prisoner. That's not how this ends for me. April 18th brings Model to the decision point he's avoided for weeks. He drafts a final message to remaining Army Group B units, a directive that amounts to releasing soldiers from their oaths and obligations. The message, transmitted via radio on April 19th, carries no dramatic rhetoric or ideological appeals. Further resistance has become meaningless. Supply situation makes continued operations impossible. Those units still capable of movement should attempt to break through to American lines for surrender. Those unable to move should negotiate local capitulations. Officers and men have performed their duties with honour, under impossible circumstances. I release you from further obligation to obey orders that cannot be executed. Save yourselves. The message represents extraordinary insubordination, a field marshal countermanding Hitler's explicit orders and authorising wholesale surrender. It also represents Model's final command decision, an acknowledgement that military reality supersedes political directives, and that a commander's duty includes knowing when continued resistance transforms from military necessity to pointless sacrifice. April 20th, Model's 54th birthday, is observed by the officers remaining at his headquarters with awkward formality that seems increasingly absurd. Staff officers present, congratulations. An orderly produces a cake made from hoarded rations. Model accepts these gestures with courtesy that masks his psychological state. The contrast between the birthday observance and the disintegrating military situation creates surreal atmosphere maintaining social conventions while the world those conventions presuppose collapses. Model spends portions of the day walking alone through the woods surrounding the headquarters, a field marshal contemplating options that have narrowed to two: surrender or suicide. Prussian military tradition, the value system that shaped his entire career, makes the choice clear even if accepting that choice proves difficult. April 21st, 1500 hours, Model walks into the woods surrounding his headquarters, accompanied only by his aide who understands what's about to happen. The two men walk for perhaps 20 minutes, moving away from the lodge into deep forest where the war seems distant, despite being only miles away. Model stops at a clearing, turns to his aide, and states with clinical precision what he intends to do and why. A field marshal doesn't become a prisoner. He repeats the phrase that has become his rationalization for suicide. Tell the men they perform their duties with honor. Tell them to survive. Model draws his pistol, steps away from the aide, and fires a single shot into his head. He dies instantly, falling among the trees in a forest that will soon be overrun by American forces advancing through the pocket's final remnants. The aide returns to headquarters and reports Model's death without elaboration. Staff officers receive the news with resignation rather than shock. Many suspected this outcome. Some privately predicted it. The question becomes what to do with Model's body and whether to inform higher command of his death. The decision is made to bury Model in the forest, marking the grave in a way that allows later recovery, and to report to Berlin that Model died in action rather than by suicide. This fiction spares his family potential stigma and avoids giving the Nazi regime opportunity to denounce Model for defeatism. The 5 generals and approximately 50 staff officers at the headquarters will surrender to American forces within 48 hours, but first they perform final duty to their commander burial with military honours in a hastily dug grave that will later be relocated to a proper cemetery. Model's stated reasons for suicide: a field marshal doesn't become a prisoner, reflect Prussian military tradition that values death before dishonour. But post-war analysis suggests more complex motivations. Model certainly faced potential war crimes, prosecution for actions on the Eastern Front, where Wehrmacht units under his command participated in atrocities against civilians and Soviet prisoners. He likely recognised that post-war Allied tribunals would examine his military record, possibly resulting in execution after trial rather than honourable imprisonment. He may have concluded that suicide offered more control over his fate's narrative than surrender and capture. The psychological burden of presiding over Army Group B's destruction, sacrificing 317,000 troops in futile defence that accomplished nothing, may have made continued life unacceptable regardless of legal consequences. Model's suicide creates command vacuum immediately filled by his chief of staff, who lacks authority to surrender Army Group B officially but can negotiate local capitulations. Within 24 hours of Model's death, the 5 generals at his headquarters contact American forces and arrange surrender of the headquarters personnel. The surrender is anticlimactic. Officers emerge from the woods carrying white flags, identified themselves as Model's staff, and request treatment according to Geneva Convention. American intelligence officers, recognizing the capture's significance, interrogate the generals about Model's fate and Army Group B's condition. The interrogations confirm what American commanders already understand. Army Group B has ceased to exist as coherent military organization, fragmented into scattered groups whose continued resistance stems from isolation or command, refusal rather than coordinated defense. The question of how many other senior Wehrmacht officers chose suicide versus surrender inside the Ruhr Pocket reveals the variation in individual responses to military catastrophe. At least 7 German generals commit suicide during the Pocket's final weeks, some before Model, others after. Their reasons vary, some from ideology, others from war crimes concerns, still others from inability to accept defeat after careers built on military achievement. But many more senior officers surrender, accepting captivity as preferable to death and viewing survival as duty to subordinates and family. The variation reflects personal values and circumstances rather than any unified Wehrmacht response to the Pocket's collapse. Model's body remains buried in the forest until May 1945, when American graves registration personnel, guided by German officers from Model's staff, recover the remains for proper identification. Personal effects confirm the body's identity: Model's field marshal insignia, identity papers, and the pistol that caused his death. The recovery enables official death report and eventual burial in military cemetery. Model's grave, relocated several times in post-war decades, ultimately rests in a soldier's cemetery near Vossenack, marked with simple stone identifying him by rank and dates. No heroic epitaphs, no political declarations, just name, rank, and the dates that bracket a career that ended in forest clearing with a single pistol shot. Model's fate symbolises the Wehrmacht's institutional end in the West. The field marshal who was Hitler's most reliable problem solver, the commander who restored desperate situations through tactical skill and ruthless determination, concluded that the final problem could not be solved and chose death over admitting defeat through surrender. His suicide changes nothing about the Ruhr Pocket's outcome. Army Group B continues fragmenting regardless of Model's presence or absence, but his death marks the psychological breaking point where even the Wehrmacht's most committed commanders acknowledge that continued resistance serves no purpose except postponing inevitable surrender. Model walked into the woods on April 21st, commanding an army group. He died commanding nothing except his own fate, exercising the last control available to a military leader whose strategic options had narrowed to choosing the manner and moment of his end. April 16th, 1945, American military government officers from 1st Army enter Essen to conduct the first systematic assessment of civilian conditions in a captured Ruhr city. What they document over the next 48 hours constitutes a humanitarian catastrophe whose scale overwhelms the limited resources available to address it. The city of 600,000 has been without adequate food for 2 weeks, without reliable water for 10 days, and without functioning medical care for a week. Civilian deaths from starvation, disease, and combat action exceed 200 daily and rising. The military government team, comprising 120 officers for responsibility, extending across 3.5 million people, realises immediately that they lack the personnel, supplies, and infrastructure necessary to prevent massive civilian mortality in the coming weeks. Their initial report to Army headquarters uses clinical language to describe desperate reality, humanitarian catastrophe in progress, immediate food imports essential to prevent mass starvation. Water infrastructure requires emergency repair to prevent disease outbreak. Medical supplies critically needed. Current resources inadequate to task by factor of 10. The civilian food situation across captured portions of the pocket represents arithmetic approaching famine. By mid-April, the average civilian caloric intake has fallen to 400 calories per person per day, roughly 1/3 of minimum nutritional requirement and less than half the already inadequate rations distributed in early April. This reduction reflects not just supply shortage, but distribution system collapse. Food that exists in scattered depots cannot reach population centres because transportation networks have been destroyed. Civilians who might seek food from rural areas cannot move freely through combat zones. The black market, which sustained many through earlier food shortages, has collapsed as merchants recognise that money has become meaningless and goods are irreplaceable. People eat what they hoarded, then eat what they can forage, then simply go hungry while waiting for liberation or death. Municipal hospital system collapse creates medical emergency within the broader humanitarian crisis. In Bochum's main hospital on April 18th, 800 patients occupy a facility designed for 400, treated by staff that hasn't received medical supply resupply for 12 days. Doctors perform amputations without anaesthesia, using vodka or schnapps when available, nothing when alcohol supplies exhaust. They treat infections without antibiotics, relying on wound drainage and prayer. They conduct surgeries without blood plasma, accepting patient deaths from shock as unavoidable. A German physician's diary from this period, discovered in hospital archives, describes medicine reverting to 19th century standards. We cut away dead tissue, hope the body fights infection, and watch patients die from injuries that proper medicine could treat. We have scalpels but no anaesthesia. We have bandages but no sulphur drugs. We have hospitals but we cannot practice modern medicine. We watch people die and know they're dying from supply shortage rather than medical necessity. Disease outbreak, inevitable given the combination of malnutrition, water system failure, and overcrowding in refugee centres, begins manifesting in mid-April. Typhus cases appear in Essen and Dortmund, the disease spreading through populations weakened by malnutrition and lacking resistance to infection. Public health infrastructure that might contain the outbreak, disease surveillance, isolation facilities, treatment protocols has ceased functioning. German health officials who might coordinate response have fled, surrendered, or lack resources to act effectively. American military government medical officers recognise the typhus threat but lack vaccine supplies, delousing equipment, or isolation facilities adequate to prevent epidemic. They file reports requesting emergency medical supplies and personnel, knowing that even urgent requests will take weeks to fulfil and disease spreads daily. Water infrastructure damage creates crisis, compounding all others. 60% of the Ruhr's water treatment plants are offline by mid-April, victims of strategic bombing, combat damage, and maintenance impossibility during the encirclement. Cities that previously delivered treated water through municipal systems now rely on emergency distribution points where tanker trucks provide minimal daily allotments. Civilians queue for hours to receive water rations insufficient for drinking, cooking, and basic sanitation. The water shortages make food preparation difficult. How do you cook potatoes without water? They make hygiene maintenance impossible. How do you wash without water? They create disease transmission vectors as desperate civilians use contaminated water sources when municipal supplies are unavailable. American engineers, assigned to assess repair requirements, calculate that restoring even minimal water service will require months of work and resources that military supply chains don't prioritize. Homeless population estimates, compiled from military government surveys in captured cities, document the physical destruction's human cost. Approximately 800,000 civilians across the Ruhr region lack permanent housing by late April, displaced by a combination of strategic bombing, destruction, and tactical combat damage. These people shelter in whatever structures remain intact: damaged apartment buildings, public buildings, church basements, anywhere offering roof and walls. They lack adequate clothing for spring weather that remains cold. They lack bedding for sleeping on floors or in cellars. They lack cooking facilities for preparing what meagre food they obtain. The homeless population includes disproportionate numbers of elderly, children, and women demographics, reflecting German military conscription that removed most adult males from civilian population years earlier. American emergency food imports represent humanitarian response that scales gradually from inadequate to barely sufficient. Initial food deliveries to captured Ruhr cities total approximately 1,200 tons daily, barely 10% of the 3,500 tons needed to provide minimal caloric intake for the trapped civilian population. Military supply officers, accustomed to provisioning armies rather than civilian populations, struggle to redirect logistics toward humanitarian relief. Food that feeds American troops comes from established supply chains running from French ports through Belgium into Germany. Food for German civilians must be requisitioned from liberated agricultural regions, purchased from still functioning farms, or imported from outside Germany entirely. The process takes time that starving civilians don't have, creating a gap between need, recognition, and response that costs lives daily. Discovery of forced labourers adds another dimension to the humanitarian catastrophe. Throughout the Ruhr's industrial facilities, American troops find approximately 200,000 Eastern European workers, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians brought to Germany as forced labour to replace German workers conscripted into Wehrmacht. These people suffered throughout the war, endured the encirclement on starvation rations, and emerged from factories and labour camps in deplorable condition. Some are already dead from malnutrition, disease, or abuse. Others are dying from conditions that medical treatment could reverse if treatment were available. Still others are physically functional but psychologically traumatized by years of forced labor under brutal conditions. Military government officers must process these displaced persons while simultaneously addressing German civilian needs, creating competition for scarce resources and raising difficult questions about prioritization. Do you feed German civilians or liberated forced laborers first when you lack food for both? Emergency feeding stations established by American military government teams and Red Cross workers represent humanitarian response inadequate to need, but better than nothing. By late April, these stations distribute approximately 50,000 meals daily across captured portions of the pocket hot soup, bread when available, occasional protein from military rations that can be spared. The feeding stations require food supplies, cooking equipment, distribution facilities, and personnel to operate all scarce in combat zones where military priorities dominate resource allocation. They feed perhaps 2% of the civilian population needing assistance, providing minimal nutrition to those who can reach distribution points, while millions go hungry because feeding stations are too far, too few, or already overwhelmed by demand. The humanitarian crisis inside the Ruhr Pocket by late April represents failure of planning and imagination more than resources. American military planners anticipated capturing industrial cities and processing military prisoners, but didn't adequately prepare for sustaining 3.5 million civilians in devastated urban areas. They assumed German civil administration would continue functioning under occupation, not recognizing that encirclement and combat would shatter administrative structures. They calculated military supply requirements precisely while treating civilian needs as secondary problem to be addressed after military operations concluded. The result is humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in slow motion as American forces capable of moving armies across Europe and sustaining offensive operations through complex logistics struggle to deliver food and water to civilian populations they liberated but cannot adequately support. The crisis will persist for months, claiming thousands of lives from starvation, disease, and deprivation that victory didn't prevent and occupation initially couldn't remedy. April 16, 1945. The mass surrenders begin not with dramatic ceremony but with exhausted men walking toward American lines in groups that grow larger each hour. Near Hagen, a German infantry company emerges from defensive positions at dawn. 217 soldiers with hands raised, carrying improvised white flags made from bed sheets and tablecloths. Their officer, a captain who looks 20 years older than his actual age of 32, requests to speak with an American commander. Through an interpreter, he explains with bureaucratic precision, "We have no ammunition remaining. We have eaten the last rations yesterday. My men can no longer fight. I request surrender under Geneva Convention terms and medical attention for our wounded." The American lieutenant receiving this surrender radios for instructions, receives authorization to process the prisoners, and watches as the German company stacks weapons and forms into orderly ranks despite obvious malnutrition and fatigue. This scene replicates across the pocket's shrinking perimeter as German units reach the breaking point where continued resistance becomes physically impossible. April 17th brings the acceleration that transforms individual surrenders into mass capitulation. 25,000 German troops surrender in a single day near Hagen, creating prisoner processing crisis that overwhelms established procedures. The numbers exceed anything American military police have experienced, not hundreds or even thousands, but tens of thousands of men requiring search, documentation, and transportation to prisoner of war camps. Hastily established collection points become temporary holding areas where Germans wait in fields surrounded by barbed wire and minimal guard forces. American soldiers, outnumbered 50-1 by their prisoners, rely on German officers to maintain discipline among troops who are too exhausted, hungry, and relieved to pose security threat. The collection points transform into impromptu cities of prisoners, Germans sitting in fields, waiting for transportation, grateful the fighting has ended even if captivity's duration remains unknown. The largest single surrender occurs on April 18th near Iserlohn, where 53,000 German troops from multiple divisions capitulate simultaneously, in coordinated action organized by surviving Wehrmacht staff officers. The surrender negotiation, conducted between German generals and American corps commanders, has formality absent from smaller capitulations. German officers arrive under white flag with prepared documents listing unit strengths, equipment inventories, and requests for prisoner treatment. They're not surrendering because American attacks have broken their positions, they're surrendering because continued resistance serves no military purpose and condemns soldiers to death from starvation or combat wounds that lack medical treatment. The American commanders accept the surrender, assign military police units to process the prisoners, and watch as the largest single-day capitulation in Western Front history unfolds through methodical procedures that take 48 hours to complete. Prisoner of war processing rates reveal the logistical challenge of managing this mass surrender. American military police and quartermaster units can process approximately 30,000 prisoners per day through established camps, searching individuals, documenting identity, assigning prisoner numbers, transporting to rear area facilities. But with surrenders averaging 20 to 30,000 daily throughout the final week, the processing system operates continuously at maximum capacity while backlogs develop at collection points. German prisoners wait days for processing, held in temporary facilities with minimal shelter and inadequate food supplies. The irony is apparent to everyone. Germans who surrendered to escape starvation now wait in captivity, still hungry, because American logistics cannot immediately feed prisoners arriving faster than supply chains anticipated. 15 hastily established prisoner of war camps across the captured pocket attempt to house the surrendering Germans, but capacity proves woefully insufficient. Camps designed for 5,000 prisoners receive 15,000. Barbed wire perimeters expand daily as more prisoners arrive. Guard forces, drawn from combat units that should be advancing rather than guarding, struggle with prisoner-to-guard ratios that make security a formality rather than reality. German officers maintain internal discipline, organising prisoners into companies and battalions that mirror military structure despite captivity. They establish sanitation protocols, distribute food when American supplies permit, and maintain order among men whose primary emotion is relief that combat has ended and survival seems probable. 29 German generals captured during the final week represent the Wehrmacht's command structure in the West being systematically dismantled. These aren't obscure staff officers or minor commanders, they're division commanders, corps leaders, and army-level officers who led formations that fought across Europe. Their capture deprives remaining German forces of experienced leadership while providing American intelligence with detailed information about Wehrmacht organization, strength, and morale. Interrogations reveal consistent themes: ammunition exhaustion, food deprivation, communication breakdown, and recognition that continued resistance was militarily futile. The generals speak candidly in captivity, acknowledging what military professionalism prevented them from stating. While commanding troops, the war was lost, the Ruhr Pocket was indefensible, and surrender represented rational response to impossible situation rather than cowardice or defeatism. Approximately 15,000 German troops remain in scattered resistance throughout the pocket by April 20th, continuing to fight despite the mass surrenders surrounding them. These holdouts occupy isolated positions in the Sauerland forests, defend towns cut off from communication with other German units, or follow commanders whose ideological commitment or personal psychology prevents surrender regardless of circumstances. Some are SS formations that view surrender as betrayal of Nazi ideology. Others are Wehrmacht units that maintain discipline and continue fighting because standing orders forbid capitulation. Still others are simply groups that lack information about the broader situation and continue resisting because they don't know that Army Group B has effectively ceased to exist. American strategy toward these holdouts shifts from aggressive reduction to containment and negotiation. Rather than assaulting every position and accepting casualties to eliminate resistance, American commanders increasingly bypass holdouts, offer surrender terms through loudspeakers and leaflet drops, and wait for starvation and ammunition exhaustion to force capitulation. This approach reflects casualty consciousness. Why lose American soldiers in final week of pocket reduction when time and supply shortage will achieve same result? It also reflects recognition that many holdouts fight from duty rather than conviction and will surrender once circumstances permit them to view capitulation as military necessity rather than personal failure. The psychological state of surrendering Germans, documented through prisoner interviews and military government reports, reveals soldiers relieved to escape impossible situation rather than defeated troops mourning military failure. Most express relief that fighting has ended. Many describe surrender as logical conclusion once ammunition and food exhausted. Some admit they contemplated desertion but feared execution by German military police more than American captivity. Few express ideological commitment to National Socialism. The Nazi Party's grip on Wehrmacht soldiers, always more organisational than philosophical for most troops, has dissolved completely under the Ruhr Pocket's physical privations. What remains are professional soldiers who performed their duties until circumstances made continued performance impossible, then surrendered with clear conscience that they'd done what could be done under hopeless conditions. The contrast between this mass surrender and the apocalyptic resistance German propaganda predicted reveals the gap between Nazi ideology and military reality. Propaganda broadcasts from Berlin throughout April described the Ruhr garrison fighting to the last man, defending every building in urban warfare that would cost Americans unsustainable casualties. The reality is, soldiers surrendering by the tens of thousands once their military situation becomes untenable, choosing survival over futile sacrifice. This discrepancy between propaganda fantasy and battlefield reality characterizes Wehrmacht experience throughout the war's final months, a high command that issues orders disconnected from possibility, troops who recognize the futility but follow orders until physical impossibility makes disobedience the only rational choice, and final surrenders that occur not from moral collapse but from pragmatic acknowledgement that continued resistance serves no purpose except additional death. By April 21st, the Ruhr Pocket's military resistance has effectively ended through progressive surrender rather than climactic defeat. Approximately 250,000 German troops have entered American captivity during the April 16th to 21st period. Remaining resistance comprises scattered holdouts numbering perhaps 15,000 troops, whose capitulation is inevitable once ammunition and food completely exhaust. The largest encirclement in Western Front history is concluding not with Stalingrad-style last stands or massive final battles, but with exhausted soldiers walking toward captivity in numbers so large that processing them becomes a greater challenge than defeating them. The Wehrmacht in the West has suffered its greatest single defeat, losing an entire army group, not primarily through American combat power, but through the inexorable logic of encirclement: cut off from supply, cut off from reinforcement, cut off from hope of relief. Trapped formations eventually surrender because the human body requires food and ammunition, stockpiles eventually empty. Everything that follows is administrative aftermath, the mechanical process of counting prisoners, documenting surrenders, and managing the human consequences of military catastrophe that claimed 300,000 German soldiers and transformed the Ruhr Valley from industrial heartland into devastated battleground where victory came at cost, measured in destroyed cities, starving civilians, and prisoners so numerous that housing them becomes a strategic challenge in its own right. April 21st, 1945, 0800 hours. The last confirmed German artillery fire in the Ruhr Pocket comes from a single gun near Attendorn, a town in the pocket's eastern remnants where scattered German units continue resistance despite the mass surrenders surrounding them. The gun, crew 4 men, operating a 75mm field piece, fires their remaining shells at American positions advancing through the town's outskirts. They have 11 rounds. They fire methodically, 1 shell every few minutes, waiting for spotters who no longer respond to radio calls. The gun falls silent after the 11th shot, not from American counter-battery fire, but from simple ammunition exhaustion. The crew sits beside their weapon for perhaps 20 minutes, discussing options in low voices, then dismantles the breech block to render the gun inoperable and walks toward American lines with hands raised. Their war ends not with dramatic last stand, but with pragmatic acceptance that soldiers without ammunition cannot fight regardless of orders or ideology. An American patrol from 8th Infantry Division encounters 200 Germans emerging from woods near Ludenscheid at 1100 hours on April 21st. The Germans wear a mixture of Wehrmacht field grey and improvised civilian clothing, carry no visible weapons, and display white flags made from undershirts and handkerchiefs. Their spokesman, a sergeant who speaks enough English for basic communication, explains their situation. "We are from different units. We have no officers. We have no food. For 3 days. We surrender." The American patrol leader, a staff sergeant with 2 years of combat experience, accepts the surrender. With minimal formality he gestures for the Germans to form into column, assigns 2 soldiers to guard them, and radios battalion headquarters to report 200 prisoners requiring processing. The entire encounter lasts perhaps 10 minutes, a routine transaction in the pocket's final day, repeated dozens of times across the shrinking perimeter. Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters at Wiesbaden issues official declaration at 1300 hours on April 21st. Organised German resistance in the Ruhr Pocket has ceased. Mop-up operations continue against scattered holdouts. The pocket is declared eliminated. The declaration lacks drama or triumphant rhetoric. It states operational facts in military bureaucraties, acknowledging that while some Germans still resist, they no longer constitute coherent defensive force capable of effecting operations. The declaration triggers administrative processes, reassignment of divisions to other sectors, redirection of supplies toward pursuit operations beyond the Ruhr, and compilation of final statistics documenting the encirclement scale. For staff officers at Army Group headquarters, the declaration marks transition from active operations to occupation administration, from fighting war to managing its immediate aftermath. The final American combat death in the Ruhr Pocket occurs at 1430 hours on April 21st when a sniper's bullet kills Private First Class Robert Morrison from the 95th Infantry Division. Morrison, 22 years old, from Kansas, was advancing through a village when German sniper identity never determined fired single shot from destroyed building. Morrison died instantly. The sniper was never found, possibly killed by American return fire, possibly escaped, possibly surrendered later without anyone knowing they'd fired the pocket's last lethal shot. Morrison's death receives no special recognition beyond standard procedures for combat casualties, body recovered, personal effects collected, notifications sent to family, grave registered for later permanent burial. He became the final American killed in the Ruhr Encirclement, dying hours before resistance officially ended. His death statistically insignificant in operation that cost 10,000 American casualties, but individually devastating to family who received telegram informing them their son died on April 21st, 1945, in place they'd never heard of, fighting in battle already won. Aerial reconnaissance flights over the former pocket on afternoon of April 21st document the surrender's visual evidence. Photographs show white flags flying from buildings across captured cities. Images reveal columns of German prisoners marching toward collection points, visible from altitude as dark lines against landscape. Reconnaissance pilots report minimal military movement except American convoys and German surrender groups. The industrial region, that strategic bombing attempted to destroy for 5 years, now sits under American occupation. Its factories silent, its cities damaged, its military garrisons surrendered or scattered. The photographs, filed in intelligence archives, provide visual record of victory, though. Whether this constitutes military triumph or humanitarian disaster depends on perspective and what metrics one considers most significant. Final prisoner count reaches 317,000 German troops, the number exceeding every estimate made during operational planning. This total represents the largest single encirclement and surrender in Western Front history, surpassing Tunisia's 275,000 prisoners and dwarfing Stalingrad's 91,000 survivors from German 6th Army. The number includes every German soldier, sailor, airman, and auxiliary service member trapped inside the pocket when it closed on April 1st. It includes combat infantry and rear area clerks, elite paratroopers and undertrained Volkssturm militia, wounded in hospitals and stragglers caught between formations. 317,000 individuals whose military service ended not in combat death but in captivity that would last months or years, depending on individual circumstances and occupation zone policies. American casualties for the entire Ruhr Pocket operation from encirclement on April 1st through final mop-up operations on April 21st. Total approximately 10,000 killed, wounded and missing. This includes casualties from the initial pincer movements, urban combat during city reductions, and scattered engagements throughout the pocket's systematic compression. The ratio of American casualties to German prisoners, roughly 1 American casualty for every 32 Germans captured, reflects the asymmetry of the battle. American forces fought with overwhelming material advantages, air superiority, and supply lines that never failed. German forces defended with depleting ammunition, without air support, and with food supplies that exhausted before resistance ended. The casualty figures document not just military victory, but the industrial age warfare reality that side with superior resources can impose its will while minimizing own losses through material superiority rather than individual valor. German military casualties killed and wounded rather than captured are estimated at 30 to 35,000 for the 3-week period. Precise numbers remain uncertain because German record-keeping collapsed during the encirclement, and many wounded later became prisoners counted in the surrender totals. The killed include soldiers who died in initial encirclement battles, city fighting during pocket reduction, scattered engagements throughout the final weeks, and executions by German military police for desertion or defeatism. They include victims of American artillery and airstrikes, combat casualties from close-quarters urban fighting, and men who simply died from wounds without medical treatment. Their graves, scattered across the pocket or consolidated in military cemeteries after the war, represent the human cost of defending position that military professionals recognized was indefensible but political leadership insisted must be held. Territory liberated totals 4,000 square kilometers of German industrial heartland and 3.5 million civilians released from encirclement that threatened them with starvation. The geographic scope encompasses cities whose names defined German industrial power: Essen, Dortmund, Düsseldorf, Bochum, Duisburg, now under Allied occupation and facing reconstruction challenges that will persist for years. 150 major industrial facilities, most damaged by combination of strategic bombing and tactical combat, fall under American control. Their value to Allied war effort is minimal. Germany's final collapse is weeks away, and these factories won't resume production before war ends. But their capture ensures Germany cannot use Ruhr production for continued resistance, closing the industrial tap that sustained Wehrmacht operations for 5 years of total war. Infrastructure damage assessment compiled by American engineers in late April reveals the Ruhr's industrial capacity effectively destroyed despite facilities remaining physically present. Furnaces lack fuel for operation. Factories lack electrical power due to generating station damage. Transportation networks cannot move raw materials or finished goods. Labor forces are dispersed, demoralized, or dead. Even if Germany possessed resources to restart production, the systematic damage to supporting infrastructure makes immediate resumption impossible. The strategic bombing campaign that failed to shut down Ruhr production through air attack alone has achieved its objective through combination of bombing damage and ground combat destruction. The industrial heart of Nazi Germany has been stopped, not temporarily but completely, its resurrection requiring years of reconstruction rather than weeks of repair. April 21st, 1900 hours. As darkness falls over the former Ruhr Pocket, the last scattered firefights end not from American attacks or German surrenders but from mutual exhaustion and tacit recognition that continued combat serves no purpose. German holdouts in forest positions realize they're isolated, surrounded, and without prospect of relief. American units pressing into the pocket's final remnants recognize that aggressive assault risks casualties for objectives already achieved. The fighting stops not from formal ceasefire but from organic de-escalation as both sides acknowledge the battle's conclusion. The Ruhr Pocket, Created on April 1st through American operational excellence and German defensive failure, ceases to exist as military reality on April 21st through the cumulative weight of surrenders, casualties, and exhaustion that makes further resistance impossible, regardless of orders from Berlin or personal commitment to duty. The Wehrmacht's greatest defeat in the West is complete, achieved not through single climactic victory but through systematic operational pressure that trapped an army group and compressed it until organized resistance simply ceased. Because the prerequisites for military operations, ammunition, food, command structure, hope no longer existed in quantities sufficient to sustain combat. April 22nd, 1945. The morning after the Ruhr Pocket's official elimination brings not celebration but logistical crisis, as American military government confronts the reality of managing 317,000 prisoners and 3.5 million desperate civilians. Processing continues at 30,000 prisoners daily, but this rate means 10 days of continuous operations to document and house all captives. The temporary collection points established during mass surrenders transform into semi-permanent holding facilities, where Germans wait in fields surrounded by barbed wire, dependent on American logistics for food, water, and basic sanitation. Military police units guard prisoners who outnumber them 50-1, relying on German officers to maintain internal discipline, while American quartermaster units struggle to supply food adequate for this sudden population explosion requiring American resources. The prisoner of war camps established across the captured pocket reveal the humanitarian challenges of managing mass captivity. Germans sleep on bare ground lacking tents or shelter. They receive one meal daily, typically bread and soup, providing perhaps 1,200 calories per person, better than the starvation they endured during the encirclement's final weeks, but insufficient for men recovering from weeks of malnutrition. Sanitation facilities comprise open trenches that serve thousands of men, creating disease transmission risks that military medical officers monitor nervously. Water distribution relies on tank trucks making rounds to camps lacking permanent infrastructure. The conditions violate neither Geneva Convention nor American military policy. They simply reflect the practical impossibility of immediately housing and feeding 317,000 prisoners captured over 3 weeks in Remagen, whose infrastructure was destroyed by 5 years of war. Albert Speer's assessment to Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who assumed leadership after Hitler's death on April 30th, documents the Ruhr loss's strategic impact with statistical precision. The memo, discovered in captured German documents, states bluntly, loss of the Ruhr has resulted in immediate economic collapse. Steel production has fallen 90%. Coal production for military purposes has ceased. Synthetic fuel plants dependent on Ruhr coal have shut down. Ammunition production cannot be sustained at rates necessary for continued operations. The war economy cannot function without Ruhr resources. Continuation of military resistance beyond 4 to 6 weeks is economically impossible. Speer's analysis, always more realistic than Hitler's fantasies, acknowledges what model recognized weeks earlier. Losing the Ruhr meant losing the war, not eventually, but immediately, because modern warfare requires industrial base that Germany no longer possesses. American intelligence assessment compiled in early May analyzes the Ruhr encirclement's impact on Germany's final collapse. The analysis credits the pocket's elimination with accelerating German defeat by an estimated 2 to 4 weeks. This might seem modest, the war would have ended regardless, but those weeks represent thousands of additional casualties avoided, prisoners taken rather than killed, and cities captured rather than destroyed in continued fighting. The intelligence officers note that German forces opposing Western allies after the Ruhr's fall offered minimal coordinated resistance, surrendering in large numbers without Wehrmacht's earlier defensive competence. The Ruhr encirclement broke not just Army Group B, but Wehrmacht morale throughout the West, demonstrating that continuing resistance led inevitably to encirclement, starvation, and mass captivity rather than honourable defeat in conventional battle. Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8th, 1945, 17 days after the Ruhr Pocket's elimination, validates the strategic assessment that losing the industrial region made continued resistance economically unsustainable. The Wehrmacht could field soldiers even without the Ruhr, but it couldn't supply them with ammunition, fuel, or equipment necessary for effective combat. Divisions existed on paper, but couldn't be equipped or sustained. The logistical infrastructure that moved supplies from factories to front lines had collapsed. German commanders increasingly recognized that ordering defensive stands without providing means to execute those orders was asking soldiers to die for a regime that could no longer support them even materially, regardless of ideological commitment. The 17 days between Ruhr Pocket elimination and final German surrender represent Wehrmacht's organizational death, the period when military institution acknowledges it can no longer function, and soldiers throughout the remaining German-controlled territory make individual decisions to surrender, desert, or simply wait for Allied occupation. Prisoner fate over subsequent months and years varies by individual circumstances and occupation zone policies. Most German soldiers captured in the Ruhr Pocket undergo screening to identify SS members, war crimes, suspects, and individuals with specialized knowledge valuable to Allied intelligence. The vast majority, ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers without criminal records or intelligence value, enter prisoner of war camps where they remain until demobilization programs release them between 1946 and 1948. Some prisoners are transferred to British or French custody for labor programs rebuilding war-damaged infrastructure. Others remain in American camps in Germany, providing labor for American military government projects. A few thousand face war crimes, prosecution for actions during the war, though most Ruhr Pocket prisoners committed no crimes beyond following orders in defensive battle. By 1948, most prisoners have returned to civilian life, reintegrating into German society that's rebuilding from total defeat. Civilian death toll estimates, compiled from municipal records and military government surveys, document the human cost of the encirclement and pocket reduction. Between 15 and 20,000 German civilians died during the April 1st to April 21st period from combination of combat, action, starvation, disease, and infrastructure collapse. This represents approximately 0.5% of the trapped civilian population, horrific in absolute numbers, but lower than worst-case scenarios that anticipated mass starvation if the pocket persisted into May. The relatively limited civilian mortality reflects several factors. The pocket's brief duration prevented complete food exhaustion, American forces captured cities faster than famine could develop fully, and military government emergency food programs, though inadequate, prevented complete nutritional collapse. Still, 15 to 20,000 civilian deaths represent tragedy layered upon war's general catastrophe. Each death an individual story of person who survived strategic bombing only to die during the final weeks of a war Germany had already lost. Infrastructure damage assessment, completed over summer of 1945, calculates total destruction at approximately $4 billion in 1945 values, equivalent to perhaps $70 billion in contemporary purchasing power. This includes factories destroyed beyond immediate repair, residential buildings leveled by bombing and combat, transportation infrastructure requiring complete reconstruction, and utilities needing systematic rebuilding. The damage results from cumulative effects of 5 years of strategic bombing plus 3 weeks of tactical combat, making attribution between causes somewhat arbitrary. What matters is that the Ruhr Valley in May 1945 is devastated industrial landscape requiring years of reconstruction to restore productive capacity. The industrial heart of Nazi Germany no longer beats it, requires complete organ transplant through Marshall Plan assistance and German reconstruction efforts before it will function again. Reconstruction timeline demonstrates the long-term consequences of wartime destruction. Ruhr steel production in May 1945 is essentially zero. By 1946, minimal production resumes using salvaged equipment and emergency repairs. By 1948, production reaches approximately 30% of 1944 levels. Not until 1951 does Ruhr steel output match final wartime production figures. And this recovery requires Marshall Plan investment, German labour, and industrial equipment that replaces rather than repairs wartime destruction. The 6-year reconstruction period from war's end to productive capacity restoration represents the true cost of the Ruhr battle, not just military defeat but economic devastation, requiring half-decade of intensive investment to remedy. The counterfactual question, could Germany have continued the war without the Ruhr, admits straightforward answer that contemporary analysts and post-war historians agree upon. No. German military operations in May 1945 consisted primarily of retreats, surrenders, and scattered resistance by units cut off from supply and command. Without Ruhr resources, Wehrmacht couldn't produce ammunition for sustained combat, fuel for mobile operations, or replacement equipment for battle losses. The army that once conquered continental Europe in months was reduced to defensive stands by formations that lacked basic military necessities. Losing the Ruhr didn't just weaken German war effort, it ended German capacity for organised military resistance. The 17 days between Ruhr elimination and final surrender represent not continued warfare, but organizational collapse playing out across German-controlled territory. The alternative scenario, where model attempted breakout instead of static defense, generates tactical speculation, but strategic consensus breakout would have failed, but might have allowed more German troops to escape encirclement. Model commanded sufficient forces on April 1st to attempt coordinated breakout to the east, accepting heavy casualties to allow a portion of Army Group B to escape the closing trap. This might have saved 50 to 100,000 troops from captivity, prolonging Wehrmacht resistance in central Germany by days or weeks. But breakout would have required abandoning wounded, sacrificing rearguard formations, and accepting that majority of Army Group B would still be lost. Model chose static defense, partly from Hitler's orders, but partly from calculation that breakout's costs exceeded benefits. Whether this judgment was correct remains debatable, but outcome was predetermined. Army Group B would be destroyed, whether through encirclement or breakout attempt. And choosing between bad options doesn't transform either into good decision. Historical comparison to Eastern Front encirclements. Stalingrad, the Ruhr Pocket, the Demyansk Pocket reveals the Ruhr encirclement's relative humanity despite its scale. Soviet encirclement battles typically resulted in near-total destruction of trapped forces through combination of combat, starvation, and harsh captivity conditions. German prisoners from Stalingrad faced death rates exceeding 90% in Soviet camps. The Ruhr Pocket, by contrast, resulted in mass captivity but relatively low combat deaths and prisoner mortality. American and British forces encircled German Army Group, accepted its surrender, and processed prisoners according to Geneva Convention, despite logistical challenges. This reflects Western Allies' military culture and resource availability. They could afford to feed prisoners and treat them humanely because their logistics supported such treatment. The Ruhr encirclement was Western Front battle, conducted with Western standards, making it deadly but not apocalyptic, catastrophic for Wehrmacht but not genocidal for individual soldiers. By summer of 1945, the Ruhr Pocket exists only in military histories, casualty lists, and prisoner of war camps, where 317,000 Germans wait for repatriation. The battlefield has become occupation zone. The industrial facilities are salvage sites. The cities are reconstruction projects. The military operation that trapped and destroyed Army Group B has concluded, leaving physical and human wreckage requiring years to clear. The largest encirclement in Western military history achieved its military objectives. German resistance in the West collapsed, Wehrmacht lost an entire army group, and Allied forces advanced to final victory without the Ruhr battle becoming lengthy siege that propaganda threatened. But achievement came at cost, measured in destroyed cities, starving civilians, and humanitarian crisis that victory didn't prevent and immediate occupation couldn't fully address. The Ruhr Pocket's aftermath is rubble, hunger, and 317,000 prisoners, a victory celebrated by strategists studying operational excellence, while survivors, German and American, military and civilian, remember primarily the human cost of industrial-age warfare prosecuted to its logical conclusion. The numbers establish the Ruhr Pocket's historical significance before analysis begins. 317,000 prisoners represent the largest single encirclement and surrender in Western military history, exceeding every previous Western Front battle and most Eastern Front encirclements. The comparison to Stalingrad is inevitable, but revealing the German 6th Army trapped at Stalingrad numbered approximately 290,000 troops when the Soviet encirclement closed, with 91,000 surviving to enter captivity after the battle ended. The Ruhr Pocket trapped more Germans than Stalingrad. An American treatment of prisoners ensured far higher survival rates than Soviet captivity provided. Tunisia's Axis surrender in May 1943 yielded approximately 275,000 prisoners, making it the Western Front's previous largest capitulation. The Falaise Pocket in August 1944, often cited as major Allied victory, resulted in approximately 50,000 German prisoners. By these comparative metrics, the Ruhr encirclement stands alone in Western military history for scale and completeness of enemy force destruction through operational maneuver rather than attrition. The casualty-to-prisoner ratio reveals the Ruhr battle's military efficiency from American perspective. 10,000 American casualties killed, wounded, and missing generated 317,000 German prisoners, a ratio of approximately 1 American casualty per 32 Germans captured. This dramatically favours the encircling force compared to most World War II battles, where casualty ratios rarely exceeded 3 or 4 to 1, even in decisive victories. The favourable ratio reflects several factors. American material superiority in artillery and air power allowed suppression of German positions while minimizing infantry exposure. German forces were starving and ammunition depleted, reducing their defensive effectiveness. And the encirclement strategy forced surrender through supply exhaustion rather than requiring direct assault on every position. From a military efficiency perspective, the Ruhr operation achieved maximum results with minimal friendly casualties, validating the encirclement strategy Eisenhower approved in March. The strategic timeline from Remagen bridge capture to Ruhr Pocket elimination spans 45 days, March 7th, when Americans seized the Ludendorff Bridge, to April 21st, when organized resistance in the pocket ceased. This compressed timeline demonstrates American operational tempo in spring 1945, when Wehrmacht's defensive capabilities had deteriorated so completely that operations requiring months earlier in the war now concluded in weeks. The rapid execution resulted from multiple factors. American forces had perfected combined arms operations through 2 years of combat experience. German forces lacked resources for sustained resistance. Air superiority allowed Americans to observe German movements and interdict supplies, and Wehrmacht morale had collapsed to a point where many units surrendered willingly when opportunity presented. The 45-day timeline makes the Ruhr encirclement one of history's fastest large-scale operational maneuvers, comparable in execution speed to German blitzkrieg operations early in the war, but conducted against professional military force rather than unprepared opponents. Eisenhower's decision to encircle rather than bypass the Ruhr receives historical vindication through results achieved. The contemporary debate between Montgomery's single-thrust strategy toward Berlin and Bradley's encirclement plan generated tensions that could only be resolved through Eisenhower's command authority. Post-war analysis suggests both strategies could have succeeded militarily, but with different consequences. Montgomery's northern thrust might have reached Berlin before Soviets, achieving political objective Churchill prioritized, but leaving Army Group B intact to threaten Allied rear areas and prolonging German resistance in Western Germany. Bradley's encirclement eliminated this threat, destroyed Wehrmacht's last major formation in the West, and accelerated German collapse at cost of abandoning Berlin race to Soviets. Eisenhower chose operational security over political symbolism, military decisiveness over propaganda victory. The choice reflects his strategic priorities throughout the Northwest Europe campaign: methodical destruction of German military power, rather than dramatic gestures that might achieve headlines while leaving enemy forces functional. Model's legacy as commander remains complex and contested among military historians. His defensive competence is undeniable. He saved multiple Eastern Front situations through tactical skill and ruthless determination. His loyalty to Hitler was absolute until the final weeks, making him valuable to a regime that increasingly doubted Wehrmacht's commitment. But his Ruhr command represents strategic failure, executing impossible orders that sacrificed Army Group B without affecting the war's outcome. Model's defenders argue he had no good options. Disobeying Hitler's orders risked execution, while attempting breakout would have destroyed his forces as completely as static defense. His critics contend that professional military officer should have recognized futility earlier and negotiated capitulation that might have saved lives. Model's suicide prevents knowing his internal reasoning, but his final decision to release troops from further obligation while choosing death over surrender suggests a commander who recognized the military situation's hopelessness but couldn't reconcile that recognition with personal values forged through decades of Prussian military tradition. The comparative analysis of major World War II encirclements reveals the Ruhr Pocket's distinctive characteristics. Unlike Stalingrad, where trapped Germans fought to near annihilation before surrendering, Ruhr defenders surrendered en masse once supply situation became untenable. Unlike the Falaise Pocket, where Allied forces attempted to close encirclement before German escape, the Ruhr trap closed completely with most German forces inside. Unlike Soviet encirclements that often featured brutal combat and mass prisoner mortality, the Ruhr operation resulted in relatively low combat deaths and humane treatment of captives. The distinctive features reflect Western Front's military culture. American forces could afford to feed prisoners and had institutional commitment to Geneva Convention compliance. German forces in the West recognized they were fighting fellow European nations rather than Eastern Front's ideological war of extermination, and both sides maintained professional military conduct even as strategic situation became hopeless for Wehrmacht. Modern military academies teaching the Ruhr operation as case study in combined arms warfare emphasize several lessons that remain relevant decades later. The encirclement demonstrates value of operational maneuver over frontal assault. Bradley's Pincer movement trapped Army Group B more efficiently than direct attack on the Ruhr would have. It illustrates importance of air superiority in modern warfare. American ability to observe German movements and interdict supplies proved decisive in preventing effective defense. It shows how logistics determines operational outcomes. German forces couldn't fight effectively without ammunition and food, regardless of tactical skill or defensive positions. And it validates the principle that destroying enemy forces is strategically preferable to capturing terrain. Eliminating Army Group B accelerated German defeat more than capturing Berlin would have. The long-term impact on NATO doctrine, developed in subsequent decades, reflects lessons drawn from Ruhr Pocket and similar operations. NATO planning emphasized operational maneuver warfare, seeking to encircle and destroy Soviet formations rather than engage in attrition battles along static lines. The doctrine assumed air superiority would enable deep reconnaissance and interdiction, similar to American advantages in April 1945. It prioritized logistics and sustainment, recognizing that modern armies require continuous supply to maintain combat effectiveness. The Ruhr Encirclement became case study, teaching NATO planners how combined arms operations, air-land, integration, and logistical superiority could defeat numerically superior forces through operational excellence rather than simple attrition. Whether these lessons would have proven valid in hypothetical NATO-Warsaw Pact conflict remains unknowable, but they shaped Western military thinking for 40 years of Cold War. The human cost assessment requires acknowledging multiple victim categories beyond military casualties. German military losses totaled approximately 30 to 35,000 killed, plus 317,000 captured, destroying an entire army group and removing those soldiers from German society for months or years. American casualties of 10,000 represent families bereaved and communities affected. 15 to 20,000 German civilian deaths during the encirclement period constitute tragedy, often overlooked in operational histories focused on military outcomes. 200,000 forced laborers liberated from Ruhr factories, but often in deplorable health, represent additional human cost of Nazi regime's wartime policies. The complete accounting of human cost reaches perhaps 360,000 individuals killed, wounded, or imprisoned during the 6-week period from early March through late April 1945, a number that exceeds many entire battles and illustrates industrial-age warfare's capacity for mass destruction. Concentrated in limited geography and time frame, the moral questions raised by the Ruhr operation resist simple answers and generate continued debate. Was the encirclement strategy morally superior to alternative approaches because it minimized combat deaths while forcing surrender through supply exhaustion? Or did it create unnecessary civilian suffering by transforming industrial region into battlefield and prison where millions face starvation? Should American forces have accepted higher casualties to capture cities more quickly and prevent prolonged civilian deprivation? Should German commanders have surrendered earlier to spare their troops and civilians, even if this meant disobeying explicit orders and risking execution? These questions don't admit definitive resolution. They reflect tragic choices inherent in modern warfare where civilian and military populations intermingle, where following orders conflicts with humanitarian concerns, and where military effectiveness measures success through enemy destruction rather than human welfare. The distinction between successful military operation and humanitarian catastrophe depends on perspective and priorities. For American military planners, the Ruhr Encirclement represented operational triumph, an entire German army group destroyed in 3 weeks with minimal friendly casualties, validating strategic decisions and tactical execution. For German military professionals, it represented catastrophic defeat resulting from strategic impossibility. Army Group B was ordered to defend position that couldn't be held with resources available, leading to inevitable destruction. For German civilians, it represented disaster that destroyed cities, killed thousands, and created starvation conditions that persisted weeks after military operations ended. For historians analysing the operation, it represents all these simultaneously: military success and humanitarian crisis, operational excellence and human tragedy, efficient warfare and devastating consequences for everyone caught in its machinery. The final assessment requires acknowledging what the Ruhr Pocket demonstrates about modern warfare's nature. Military forces can be destroyed not just through combat but through encirclement that cuts supply lines and starves armies into submission. Industrial-age warfare's material requirements mean that logistical superiority often determines outcomes more decisively than tactical skill or soldier courage. Civilian populations in industrialized regions cannot be separated from military operations. making them inevitable casualties of battles fought in urban terrain. The distinction between defeating an enemy and destroying them completely is often a choice made by commanders with power to accept, surrender, or prosecute operations to annihilation. And the operational timescale of modern encirclement battles, measured in weeks rather than months, creates humanitarian emergencies that unfold faster than relief efforts can address them. The Ruhr Pocket stands as the largest surrender in Western military history, a monument to American operational competence and Wehrmacht institutional collapse. 317,000 prisoners document the scale. Destroyed cities document the cost. 15,000 civilian deaths document the tragedy that accompanies military victory when battlefields encompass industrial regions housing millions. The operation succeeded brilliantly by military metrics, while creating humanitarian catastrophe by human welfare standards. This duality defies simple historical judgment. The Ruhr encirclement was simultaneously strategic triumph and human disaster, efficient military operation and devastating experience for everyone caught inside the 60-mile circle of destruction that closed on April 1st and compressed until nothing remained but rubble, hunger, and the largest mass of prisoners any Western army ever processed. Understanding the Ruhr Pocket requires holding both realities simultaneously, acknowledging military success while recognizing human cost, and accepting that modern warfare generates outcomes that can be celebrated strategically while mourned humanely without contradiction.